You do not want to miss this story.
Is there the kind of upside?
Stocks just finishing up the trading day here in Europe, and it has been a bruising session for most of these European indices. The trouble started in the overnight session in Asia, in China, where we had a pretty broad sell-off in Hong Kong stocks and China stocks because we didn't get any details of stimulus coming out of China State Council meeting. Now, you had a negative China session bleed into a negative Europe one, and the fact that the U.S. is on holiday today, there's no cash equity trade, you don't have any sort of positive impulse coming from the U.S. to lift up European stocks. So we had a pretty dour session. CAC 40, one of the worst performing regions, that is down more than 1%. That's what you would expect if you're looking for a China exposed region. Meanwhile, DAX, that's falling about 1%. FTSE 100, a little bit better, still negative session. That's down about 0.7%. IBEX, that falls around 0.8%. FTSE MIB, that does better. Banks, actually one of the better performing sectors, though it was just a bad day all around for sectors. So in terms of the trade itself, volumes were pretty light, much lighter than you would expect on a normal day. Again, that's not surprising considering that the U.S. is offline today, although of course futures are trading in the U.S. and they are trading down. We really just kind of sunk throughout the entire session. We opened up lower and then we continued to fall as we got to the close, again about down more than 1%. Please excuse me as I readjust my mic here. Okay, so here we have the trading session. The banks index, this is what I was talking about, and part of the reason why the FTSE MIB didn't do as poorly. Banks actually ended higher, I mean, ever so slightly, so just 0.03%, but everything else was really negative. Chemicals, construction, basic resources, those were the three worst sectors. That's a problem. That's what would sell off if you were concerned about the economy. These are very heavily cyclical type indices. And then you had insurance, energy, technology. I don't know, energy at the top maybe is a little bit contrarian to that, but still insurance and technology, maybe some of the bond proxies. Now, for those individual stock movers, Sartorius, now this is a company that supplies COVID lab equipment. That fell some 14.5%. They supply 4 to 5 COVID labs, saying that demand just isn't there. So those shares fell as they cut their outlook. Fast Partners, this is a Swedish real estate company. They got cut to junk. There's a lot of concerns about the Swedish market at this moment, considering that there's a lot of floating note rates. We saw SBB, another Swedish company, fall into trouble as well. LVMH, again, this is really the China trade. Here's where we see it play out. It fell nearly 2%. Max Kettner was just talking to us saying that the China trade was a little bit more tricky, hence why he wouldn't want to own this. All right, that is the picture for your European equities. Let's talk about aviation. Let's get back to the Paris Air Show, where Guy Johnson is there with a guest. Guy.
Yeah, our final guest of the day, Danny, thank you very much indeed. Eric Trempier is the CEO of Dassault Aviation. Dassault makes the Rafale fighter jet, the Mirage fighter jet. It makes the Falcon business jet line as well. It is a well-diversified business. Eric, nice to see you.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us. Let's start off and talk about what is happening in Ukraine right now. Has the war in Ukraine changed permanently, do you think, the thinking when it comes to how Europe spends on defense? Do you think there has been a shift, or is that shift still yet to come?
Yes, there is a big change. Most of the European countries could have think that no war is possible anymore in Europe.
Yep.
And we have a kind of war at the border of European Union, which is in Europe, because Ukraine is in Europe. So it shows that you always need to be prepared at war in order to prevent war, which was not the case there.
So we are going to see structurally higher defense budgets going forward from here?
I think so, that in Europe there is a kind of taking into account the fact that a war is possible.
Yep.
Then you need to increase the budget if you want to keep your people in a peace world and safe, to avoid war. In fact, you need to be prepared. You need to increase the budget to avoid war.
There is a suggestion, and training is already underway, that we could see the Ukrainians armed with F-16s. What about Mirages? What about the Rafale that we saw flying here earlier on?
Well, this is a decision of the government, so I cannot comment. Up to now, there is no wish to transfer Mirage or Rafale from France to Ukraine, but it's really a governmental decision.
Could there be training? How quickly could pilots be trained on these aircraft?
They are trained on modern fighters, and pilots could either fly F-16 or Mirage or even Rafale, because they would be trained at these Western standard fighters.
There still seems to be, though, a bias in Europe to buying American when it comes to military kit.
Yes, it's true, because it's a kind of alliance spin-off that you are in the NATO alliance and you want to buy US. And well, we believe that we have a good offer, which was the Mirage, which is now the Rafale. We may see that Greece, for example, bought the Rafale. So there is an alternative to the US. It's not against the US, but I still believe that Europeans should buy European manufacturers' aircraft. That would be good to build up Europe.
It's not just the Russia-Ukraine situation that obviously people have got their eye on right now. It is the situation that is developing in Asia. The geopolitical tension around China seems to be increasing. Where do we stand with the potential Rafale sale to India at the moment?
Well, we sold Rafale to India already. They all are delivered, which was on time, despite the COVID crisis. And we'll see what the future is going to be. I cannot answer right now to the question that new orders taken by India. We are supporting Rafale for Indian Navy. It is known, and we are waiting for a decision.
You bring up the issue of supply chains. The supply chain is a massive problem on the civil side. How is it affecting the military side? Are aircraft being affected? Are deliveries being affected? Why are we in this situation?
We faced problems with the supply chain, which is true for civilian aircraft as well for military ones. We are not so much delayed in delivering Rafale. It's a little bit more difficult with the civilian aircraft, with the Falcon, which means that the supply chain from the US or the supply chain from France are facing difficulties, mainly because of labor shortage. After the COVID, many workers left the companies, and it took time to recover this situation, but it's getting a little bit better now.
Getting a little bit better. So you think you will have this resolved by when?
Well, we are now trying to get 1,000 more workers in 2023. It was 1,000 more in 2022 for a company like us, which is about 12,000. So it's a huge level of getting new employees. Same story with the supply chain. So it's step by step that we are recovering. So delay is not so much, and we can guarantee our customers that they will get their aircraft on time.
We're seeing the Dutch government's pushing back on business jets, private jets. Is that something that you see being replicated elsewhere?
No, I think it's really in this part of the world. It's maybe Netherlands, it's maybe France, it may be others. There is a kind of push from some political side to say that private jets, but we are business jets. Business jets is just to fuel economy. Big companies, 80% of the business jets are with companies who are fueling economy. 10% are with governments, so it's governmental aircraft, and 10% only private. So if we want the economy to recover, to continue for the progress, we need to get this tool. It's a tool for the companies, and I don't see why we should prevent these type of aircraft to be sanctioned compared to the commercial ones. There is no reason why.
Does Europe feel anti-aviation?
Yes and no. I think we give the voice of those who are against a little bit higher than those who are supporting.
How do you solve that? Is it a communication issue? What do you
Yes, communication issue. They are very proactive. But if you give a look on this air show, obviously the first part of the air show is professional, but everyone is around. And you will see during the weekend, the families are going to be here at Le Bourget, which means that it's a popular exhibition. So they want to see these beautiful machines flying. They are still attracted by the passion of aeronautics, and we will take advantage of this weekend to recruit also.
To recruit staff?
Yeah.
That's an interesting, The French president was here earlier. What message did you give him?
Well, the message is that we shall continue to promote the Rafale together, because there is a strategic link between the countries who are buying the Rafale. We are continuing to promote our aircraft at the commercial side. We are also preparing the future, whatever is the future, but with new technologies, with, for example, collaborative combat, with cloud combat, and that is going to take place with the Rafale, with different standards. We are now at F3, then F4 is coming, F5 is under preparation, and then we will shift to the next generation later on.
Eric Trappier, CEO of Dassault. A great pleasure. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Danny. Le Bourget.
Guy, thank you very much. And a really fantastic day of interviews. It's been a long day for Guy. He's going to do it again tomorrow. A lot more to come on this. And if you want to find out more about the Paris Air Show, subscribe to the official Bloomberg Paris newsletter. You can scan the QR code that you see right in front of you here. All right, let's check where European stocks have settled as we head to the break. The Euro Stoxx 600, the overall index falling more than 1%, that being led lower by the CAC 40. The worst day for European equities in about 3 weeks. FTSE 100, that fares a little bit better, maybe helped out by some of the FX impulse of a weaker sterling today. Meanwhile, the DAX, that just narrowly missing a decline of 1%. This is Bloomberg.
Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
It was unimaginable that we would see rates move this fast. That was not in the realm of thinking.
Just the timeline of what they knew and when they knew it. Why didn't they do anything about it?
When do we have to see the kill? It's for the Fed to respond to it. And this is really the tension.
Be informed.
You cannot be overly data dependent. You've got to have a view of where you're going.
Be prepared.
I think the earnings season might actually be the positive surprise that people are not expecting.
Be ahead of the game.
Certainly the beginning of something we need to keep an eye on.
And that, I think, is really going to be an interesting takeaway from this moment.
You go all birds on us and you say, turn, turn, turn. Is that what we're doing right now?
Yeah, big question coming into this year for us was, when is that turn going to be?
What a fantastic conversation.
The news you need.
The president's calling on manufacturers to make more in America. It is working, and it's reflected in these jobs numbers.
The analysis you trust.
How do you take this anecdotal data and say, really, just focus on the now, because that is going to tell you where we're going?
What is the measurement of uncertainty that we have in studying the American economy?
Milton Friedman had said there are long and variable lags in the impact of monetary policy. But man, it's a long slog.
The best way to start your day.
People are tuning into this program on a daily basis.
Oh, come on, it makes for good TV.
Let's move on.
Bloomberg Surveillance, weekdays from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern.
Okay, so you're moving in on me, quick. Distracting me with your fancy hands. I'm going to deal with your knight because it's really bothering me.
Ah, my knight.
Yeah, he's a troublemaker.
Yeah.
What did you get up to this weekend?
You know, just robot stuff. A lot of chess. I was practicing for you. I know you're pretty good. Ooh, I don't like that. I will take this. Put it over here.
Not cool. Not cool. All right. I will concede. I can see. Got me beat.
Very good game. Well played.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
The Bank of England is set to reveal its rate decision on Thursday. Bloomberg opinion columnist Mohammed El-Arian tweeted earlier about the upcoming decision, saying it is a big week for the Bank of England and a tricky one, too. While there is little doubt that the BOE will increase interest rates on Thursday, there will be lots of views on the size of the hike and policy guidance for what follows as standalone and in combination. Indeed, of the four major central banks, the BOE faces one of the trickiest sets of policy challenges. For more, let's get to Jennifer McGowan, Capital Economics Chief Global Economist. Jennifer, really great to speak with you today. How difficult is the BOE's prospects come this Thursday? How difficult of an environment is this to be a central bank in the UK?
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult environment for most central banks at the moment, of course. But I think the UK, the Bank of England, does have it particularly hard. On the one hand, we've got particularly high wage growth in the UK, which is clearly a real problem from the Bank of England's perspective. Inflation still above 8%, even core inflation above 6%. So I think it's pretty clear that this next decision needs to be a hike. But at the same time, the economy is very fragile. It may well be, we expect the UK to slide into recession in the months ahead. And the Bank of England will be conscious of that fragility at the same time.
Yes, and to that point, finally today, not finally, I'm saying it like it's a good thing, but we had mortgage rates go above 6%. How painful is this period going to be for the consumer, and does that increase the risks that the BOE is going to over-tighten?
Yeah, it is going to be very painful. 6% mortgage rates are going to hit a lot of people very hard. And the other thing to bear in mind, as well as the fact that it's taking time for rate hikes to feed through into market interest rates and mortgage rates, it's also taking time for that to feed through into what people are actually paying. And we've had a bit of a shift in the UK from very variable interest rates towards something more like 2-year fixes on average. So as people start to, as those fixes come up for renewal, more and more people are going to be hitting these higher and higher mortgage rates. And that's really going to affect the amounts that people have available to spend.
Inflation's still around 8%. Is this an economy that looks primed for stagflation?
Yes, I think unfortunately it is. We still have a major issue in the UK of labour supply and a very tight labour market because of that. So we're not really in an environment where the labour market is really steaming ahead in a really, really strong state. But we are in an environment nonetheless where the labour market is very tight because of limited supply, and that's still driving up wage growth and meaning that you're getting these really strong price pressures coming through in underlying inflation, not just in headline, at the same time that you've got this weakness in the real economy.
And at the same time, we have a Fed that looks like it's on its pause, its skip, its jump, whatever you want to call it. How much does that hold back the BOE in terms of hiking as the US slows down?
I don't think it really does at all, particularly given that, as you said, the Fed's made it pretty clear that this is a skip or a pause. This isn't an end in the tightening cycle. And at the moment, there's much less evidence in the UK of an easing of price pressures, particularly stemming from the labour market. In the US, we've seen wage growth start to ease off. That's not so in the UK. So I think it's pretty clear that from the Bank of England's perspective, there is more to be done. And the Fed itself has made fairly clear that there probably is a bit further to go there in any case.
Right. Well, just on the Fed, is this kind of what hikes are going to look like from now on from them? This kind of staircase approach of step up, pause.
Maybe. It wouldn't be that surprising if towards the end of a cycle you started to get the odd pause here and there just to gauge the impact of what, after all, has been a really aggressive tightening cycle already. But that said, I think the experience of previous cycles suggests that they do turn relatively quickly. They don't tend to peter out. Every cycle's different, but the norm is that they don't really peter out. It will be more normal for there to be a sudden stop, a slight pause, and then to move into cuts. And that is actually what we at Capital Economics are expecting from the Fed. We do think there'll be another hike in July, but we think that perhaps the September hike that currently seems to be priced in might not materialise as the economy continues to weaken, and that the evidence that we've already seen of some let-up in core price pressures starts to strengthen.
I guess why sort of signal 2 hikes then, if it is this more aspirational thing from the Fed? Is it just to make sure this market isn't pricing in cuts? What purpose do they serve then?
Yeah, there may be some of that. There's certainly a real risk that when markets start to price in cuts and start to look ahead too far, that has an implication for financial conditions in the here and now. So you start to negate the tightening that you're trying to do if you're trying to indicate at the same time that you may be at the peak in the cycle, that cuts may not be too far off. So there's probably an element of that. But also just the real element of caution. Central banks keep being taken surprise, not least the Fed, but perhaps particularly the Fed, by the persistence of core inflation, by the stickiness of core inflation, and by the resilience of labour markets. So I think the Fed probably genuinely does need to wait for some more evidence of that, for some more evidence of an easing in labour market conditions, a further slowdown in wage growth, perhaps some easing in core components of the CPI like rents, to be more confident that it is time to end the tightening cycle.
Okay, Jennifer, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your week. That's Jennifer McEwen, Capital Economics Chief Global Economist. Now, coming up, we move away from central banks and talk about AI, what yogurt and the red hot technology have in common. There's something, apparently. We're going to take a look at Danone's AI strategy next. This is Bloomberg.
One of the ones we're working on at the moment is how do we charge back into Ukraine as soon as the European authorities say it's safe to fly in Ukraine again. Now, nobody knows when that is going to be. But we were Ukraine's second largest airline when the Russians invaded on the 24th of February last year. We would be Ukraine's biggest airline the week after they tell us it's safe to go back in there, because we're going to charge back in there. Initially, we have a plan to open up about 30 routes from 4 Ukrainian airports back into the European Union. And then we want to, I think, within 6 to 12 months, open up 3 or 4 large bases in Ukraine. And we're talking to the Ukrainian authorities about creating an environment cost agreement on which we could lead the charge of air travel into a post-war Ukrainian recovery.
Performing global equity fund is winning big by betting on AI, but not where you might think. Fairlight Asset Management is scouting small mid-cap companies that will be enhanced by AI, like German online marketplace Scout24, which is up 26% year-to-date, or Copart, a U.S.-based cart auctioneer website, up 43%. Now, this Sydney-based fund also holds Nordson, a maker of hot melt glue dispensing equipment. I'm going to be honest, I have no idea what that is, on expectations that it will benefit from the increased chip demand, though the shares are little changed so far this morning. Now, there is so much happening on AI, so let's stick with this theme and, throw some yogurt into the mix, make a smoothie, if you will. Because a 104-year-old French company, Danone, is in its second year of a turnaround effort that hinges on a yogurt renaissance based on AI and machine learning. Guys, yogurt is cool again. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Dasha Afanasayeva on this. Okay, what is AI? What is Danone actually doing here? AI and yogurt, I mean, these two things don't compute in my brain.
Well, so Danone's biggest unit is the yogurt unit, and it's been struggling for the last 7 of the last 9 years. It's had declines in volumes, and that's even before you've got the hit of the cost of living crisis, which sees shoppers trading down, choosing supermarket brands over leading brands like Danone. And what Danone's realized is that it can make these connections. It can use AI to analyze decades of data, decades of research of bacteria, how it interacts with the gut, how it interacts with other ingredients, to figure out and make links between health benefits and health outcomes and particular aspects of bacteria. And a human just wouldn't be able to do this. You need AI to notice all these links so that you're not testing one hypothesis at a time. You're just throwing it all on the wall and seeing what sticks.
I mean, there's so many claims, though, made by the health food industry. Health, fitness is something obviously the world is really concerned about now. How do you sort of separate the marketing claims versus actual science and beneficial use of this AI?
I think that's the issue. It's very difficult to, and I think from the perspective of these companies, they combine a track record of consumers trusting them with some of this science and some of this marketing and the ability to sell things in bulk and to bring these, what they say are benefits, to lots of people. But I think essentially, there's a lot we still don't know about nutrition. There's a lot of research that still needs to happen. There's lots of competing advice. So for example, you'll have companies like Danone and Nestle say that they patented a strain, or they patented the particular, the particular aspects, health benefits of a particular strain, so that they can claim them. But really, a lot of it's just fermented milk, isn't it?
Still, you've made it exciting. You've made yogurt exciting again, Dasha. Thank you so much. Our reporter, Dasha Afanasayeva, there. And that does it for this special edition of Bloomberg's Bloomberg Markets. This is Bloomberg.
Been so used to the fact that every time there's a problem, central banks come and ease. This has been the kind of playbook, throughout my career, before that, after I left. Now we're in a very different environment. Central banks actually have to create a recession, in essence, to get back to price stability. So it's a complete reversal of the modus operandi, in a sense, of central banks as they've known it for the last several decades. So that's why it's not so much that they're getting something wrong. They've now acknowledged that there is this trade-off, these costs to pay, But it's a completely different way of thinking about central banks, and it's a different role. Another way to put it is they have to be unpopular now in order to get inflation back down, where it used to be you could count on them each time to rescue you, to stabilize the system, to bring support. And that has shifted. And I think many people, even in the markets, have not quite understood in my mind how much we are now in a different regime compared to the last 4 decades, effectively.
So it's what, almost an easing bias in the markets? How would you describe it?
In the U.S., yes. And I think it's this idea, this almost pre-programmed idea, when there is a problem, i.e. potential recession, central banks will come and ease.
Bloomberg UK, your source for news and analysis covering the biggest challenges facing the UK government, economy, financial services and markets.
Tax cuts should not be the priority. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
In this post-Brexit world, how do you see actually servicing your clients?
It was disruptive, and it's going to have implications to how capital raising works.
Now we're having the perfect storm in the UK.
Watch Francine Lacqua Thursdays at 9:30 a.m. only on Bloomberg, your global business authority. This June, in honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month. Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question. Great question.
That's a question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
There are few living people who have had as great an impact on how the world stands today as Henry Kissinger. He has advised American presidents since the 1960s, stood toe-to-toe with the likes of Chairman Mao, Golda Meir, and Vladimir Putin, changed the fortunes of countries in ways that are still admired, condemned, and debated. 70 years ago, as a young man at Harvard, Kissinger wrote that in the life of every person there comes a point when he realizes that out of all the seemingly limitless possibilities of his youth, he has in fact become one actuality. One's journey across the meadows has indeed followed a regular path. Having just celebrated his 100th birthday, you might imagine Henry Kissinger's path is now set. In fact, he is plainly still involved in public life, still talking to leaders around the world. His legacy can be felt from Cuba to Cairo, but we've broken this interview into 3 geographic parts. Europe, where he was born, the United States, where he found power and fame, and Asia, which he transformed. And then we have a more personal epilogue to do with that legacy. Henry Kissinger was born in 1923 in the German town of Fürth. 2 years later, Adolf Hitler came to the town to denounce its Jewish citizens. I began by asking Henry Kissinger how his first 15 years of persecution and chaos, which only ended when his family escaped to America in 1938, has shaped his worldview.
I spent my youth within a disintegrating society. The German society was collapsing into the Hitler period. So gradually, in each election, the Nazi party gained. And then when Hitler finally came to power, I, together with all my family and all the people I knew well, became part of a discriminated minority, living in a town in which there were signs at every public place that Jews are not welcome here, and at the entrance to every town when you entered it by train or car or anywhere. So that was my youth.
Do you think that your view of the world, of something that needed some degree of order, if you look back...
Well, I believe that for a society or for a group in which people lived, stability was a precondition for creativity. Now, that's not a thought I had then so precisely, but stability meant a great deal.
The next time you came back to Germany was in the war. You came back as a soldier. You fought in the Battle of the Bulge. You saw the concentration camps. You took part in this, the rounding up of Nazis, all by the age of like 24, 25. That is a hinterland that very few people in modern politics have. If you look at the people you dealt with, de Gaulle, Mao, all those people, they had seen warfare.
Well, I came back to Germany as a rifleman in the 84th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. And so I saw war in its most immediate form, under circumstances in which your fellowship with your fellow soldiers is your hope of survival. And everything depends on it. And I was lucky that my fellow soldiers of that period were from northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. It was called the Rail Splitter Division after Lincoln. And so that was the environment. So then, as the battle neared the German border, during the Battle of the Bulge, I was transferred to intelligence, which was still at the front, but not right in it, about 2 miles back in the civilian population. But so I saw the impact of authoritarianism and totalitarianism in my youth, and of war in the next period. And so it was an experience which is so elemental that it becomes part of you, because it shows both the dangers, but also the sense of unity of a community when they believe in fundamental. We know today that German tanks were probably better than our tanks. But you could never convince American soldiers of this, because they were convinced that if better tanks could be built, we'd be building them. And I've never forgotten that.
For most of your life, you were dealing with world leaders who had somewhat similar experiences. You could argue, but they'd seen combat. But the last American president to be in that state was the first President Bush. You look around the leaders of the Western world now, they're all people, some of them closer to my age than yours, who've never seen those things. And I wonder whether you think that makes a difference to world politics. Do you worry about that with today's leaders?
I think that leaders who have not had an experience of catastrophe or at the edge of catastrophe sometimes believe they have more options than they really do.
Interesting.
And that is characteristic of our time, especially in the West.
Because the one exception possibly is Xi Jinping, because he went through the Cultural Revolution, didn't he? So he would have had some experience of the terror that you would have seen.
Well, for Xi, a crucial experience was living in a cave with his father after his father, a Red Army leader, was purged by Mao. And in his conversations before he became president, he would refer to the fact that this experience made him strong.
As you said, you grew up in this period of chaos and disintegration. You seem to be somebody who does not want Russia, if it loses the war in Ukraine, to be overly punished. Is that in part because you saw what happened to Germany? The Germany before the First World War was seemed a very proud, successful country. The best universities, the best all these things. Then humiliation and disintegration follows. Do you worry about that with Russia?
I worry about the fact that Russia has been an integral part of European history for 600 years. And in a very special way, because it is infinitely larger than any European country. And it has always been part of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. That's a unique aspect of Russia in comparison to the European countries. So it has been torn throughout its history between a desire to become fully European and a fear of European technical superiority or capacity. Europe will become more stable, the world will become more stable when Russia accepts the fact that it cannot conquer Europe, but it has to remain part of Europe by some sort of consensus, as other states do. But I don't want Russia so crushed that it ceases being a factor of international politics in other regions and becomes a subject for European competition among the various states. So it is important for Ukraine to be preserved and for Ukraine to emerge from the war as an autonomous, strong, and democratic country. We have substantially achieved this objective by now. It can still be improved in terms of the borders of Ukraine in the what I hope will be the concluding phases of the war. But I would prefer to preserve Russia because the dissolution of Russia or the reduction of Russia to resentful impotence would set up a new set of tensions.
Do you think Vladimir Putin is somebody who could live with that parameter? You said you want a Russia that realizes where its borders are.
One needs to remember two things about Vladimir Putin, that he is, on one level, the inheritor of traditional Russia, and therefore has the tendencies towards assertion that I've described earlier. But there's also a Vladimir Putin who grew up in the siege of Leningrad, in which over half of the population died of starvation and under constant threat. But he has translated that into never wanting European military power to be in easy reach of St. Petersburg and major cities like Moscow. So when the border of Europe at the end of the war, which was the military border of Europe, which was in the center of Europe, moved to within 300 miles of Moscow and maybe 50 miles of St. Petersburg, he reacted very strongly. And as it turns out, at the edge of irrationality,
You once said to me that Vladimir Putin was more Dostoevsky than Hitler. Do you still think of him in that way?
Yeah, I think he's a Dostoevsky-type figure, beset by ambivalences and unfulfillable aspirations, but not devoted to power in the abstract, but very capable of using power. And as it turned out, he used it excessively in relationship to Ukraine. I would like a Russia that recognizes that its relations to Europe have to be based on agreement and a kind of consensus. And I believe that this war will, if it ended properly, may make it achievable.
If it's ended on the terms you're describing, do you think Vladimir Putin can survive in power?
It's improbable.
On the other side of the fence, at the moment we have the Ukrainian counteroffensive seems to have begun. Do you see that as the last offensive before you have to move to diplomacy and peace talks of some sort?
Well, I began to urge moving towards diplomacy a year ago, when I urged that the various parties to the conflict ask themselves how they want to end it. Not that they would end it right at that point, but that they would know what their political aims were. I think that becomes increasingly important as time goes on. Lest we wind up at a point where the war becomes its own objective, and where military operations and military relations between powers dominate all of this geopolitical thinking. And at that point, countries like China will have to become, from their point of view, increasingly active. And that would spread it into a world conflict.
Do you think that that is actually the real danger, that the Donbass doesn't become Europe's frontier with Russia? It becomes sort of Europe's frontier with China, that Russia gets driven back into the arms of China?
Well, it could happen because Russia gets driven back, or because Russia collapses. And disintegrates as a functioning major autonomous state, and therefore it requires thought in this current phase, which I support. I think we were correct in resisting the attack on Ukraine.
We talked about China and Russia. One power that could emerge much more powerfully from this particular episode is Germany. Germany is probably the country that's going to rebuild Ukraine if it happens. It may be involved in rebuilding Russia. And within Europe, if you visit Spain, if you visit Italy, you can feel that the frontier of Europe has been dragged to the east. So the center of Europe is now closer to Berlin, so to speak. And that Germany, by the fact it's been involved in supplying more arms and everything like that, that it looks set to become a bigger power in Europe. Do you agree with that, firstly? And secondly, do you think that Germany is ready for that task?
I agree that with this description of the transformation of the center of gravity in Europe, it's been inherent since before World War I, and was one of the causes of World War I, because of the refusal of other countries to accept this reality but also because of the inability of Germany to understand the transformation of its own position. Because the leading country has to be an example of moderation and wisdom in balancing the interests of all the countries if they are to be participants in the system. And historically, Germany wanted to exercise its potential by domination. And its tragedy has been, after the retirement of Bismarck, the failure to learn this lesson, which dragged it into two training wars, which altered the entire position of Europe in the world. So now it is again in this position, and it has no leaders with an experience of either the Nazi period or of the war. So they have to construct the system by themselves. And they're new, they're in office only a year or so. And this is not a reflection on their abilities, but a description of a new challenge for them that hasn't existed in that form before.
Do you think that it also causes problems for the other great powers? You know, you wrote a lot of history about containing, first containing France, then containing Germany, and now there is an issue. If you are France,
well, if Germany was in conflict with France since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, because French policy was explicitly based on maintaining the balance of power within Central Europe, which in practice meant maintaining a division of Germany between competing states. And France, partly to mistakes that Germany made, and Britain came to look at Germany as a threat to its sea power. So when the wall fell, neither the British nor the French leader were enthusiastic about the unification of Germany. But the reality is that a British Prime Minister in the 80s and 70s, when Germany was unified as the last major European country to be unified in 1871, said this will have a greater impact than the French Revolution. So we are at this moment now when a new structure of Europe has to be created based on this reality. And I'm describing the challenge here, I'm not saying that the Germans have failed. It's new, and it's a new challenge for this generation.
it's also a challenge for France and Britain very quickly. They've followed very different paths, especially since Suez. France has very much defined itself often in opposition to America, and it's buried itself in the European Union. The British, by contrast, have tended to stick with the Americans, and now they are outside the European Union. And you and I can argue about who's got things right over the past 50 years, but we are where we are. And I wonder, you look at France and you look at Britain now, who is better placed to go forward? Britain outside the European Union, France inside it?
Psychologically, Britain is better placed because in the structure of the world that one can imagine appearing, whatever Europe does to its own construction, cooperation with America and pursuing parallel policies with America will have to be an essential component on it, because by itself, opposing all the other major power centers, Europe is in a difficult position to do that, and it may be impossible. So Britain historically is better placed to do it. Britain's problem is its connection, how to connect with Europe, not how to connect with the United States. It has the history of the special partnership and an instinctive fear in Britain that the danger comes from across the oceans and comes from across the border, while in Europe the instinctive fear is the danger comes from land invasion. So for Britain to link to Europe has turned out to be not possible organically. So it now has to be done by policy. And I think that...
So you actually think Britain would, might disagree with you on this, but you think that Britain is sort of psychologically happier outside the European Union?
Yes, I think it is. And I think it's also a great opportunity for it to act as a link between a unifying Europe and America.
How did Jeff Bezos realize you could sell anything on the internet?
The web was growing at something like 2,300% a year. Anything growing that fast is gonna be big.
Why did Bill Gates create Control-Alt-Delete?
Kind of become the poster child of, hey, couldn't you have made this stuff a little simpler?
And what inspired Diane von Furstenberg to create the wrap dress?
The wrap dress created me.
On the David Rubenstein Show, I uncover the untold stories of the world's most successful leaders, right here on Bloomberg.
When U.S. jobs numbers are released, Bloomberg brings you crucial data at terminal speed and instant expert analysis. Nobody covers jobs day like Bloomberg.
America has never been true to itself unless it meant something beyond itself.
Henry Kissinger said those words about his adopted homeland in 1973. He first arrived in the United States in 1938 as a 15-year-old refugee. I began the second part of our conversation about the United States by asking if his life story was uniquely American. Could he have achieved what he has done anywhere else?
Absolutely uniquely American. I was at a dinner in Germany where the German Chancellor of the Democratic Germany was present, and the American ambassador rather amazingly asked the Chancellor what would have happened to me in Germany if I had survived into this period. And he said, I would be a junior professor in Munich at Munich University.
That brings us very nicely to the next phase of your life. You go to Harvard. I think at different times of your life, you had thought about chemistry and being an accountant, which is a wonderful image. But one of your mentors, Fritz Kramer, had a phrase about you were musically tuned to history. You go to Harvard, and the other kind of great figure of your youth, Bill Elliott, a professor at Harvard, directs you towards the philosophy of history, rather than just history itself. And that's where you get all the Kant or the Spinoza. Is that a really important difference? You've always been obsessed not just by history, but the ideas behind it.
Later on in life, my views and those of many of the academic community at Harvard can be charitably described as not parallel. But in that period of my life, which in a funny way was a second immigration into America, the first from Germany and the second from the army, Harvard played a very important role because it gave me confidence or inspiration, it's a better word, into the direction. I was sort of divided. I was doing extremely well in chemistry, mostly based on memory. And I went to see the head of the chemistry department. His name was Professor Kistiakowski, became a very well-known figure. And I asked him whether I should major in chemistry. And he said, if you have to ask me, no. And so this then, but I was on that other course already inwardly. It gave me the confidence to do it. The philosophy, I was most interested at first in philosophy, in theory of knowledge and theory of values. But history is a way to combine the inherent uncertainties of philosophy, inherent because so far no absolute answers have ever been found by any civilization, with the results of what actually happened. And so as I progressed in development. I became philosophy of history became my dominant theme. And I think if one reads my books, that theme runs through all of them.
Where in your life has that idea of the philosophy of history been the ideas been most challenged by reality? You've said that history is interesting because you get reality conflicting with the ideas.
No, life is torn between managing the present and the evolution of the present, so that in individual lives, and of course magnified into society's lives, there's always the ambiguity that emphasis on the present leads to stagnation, and that therefore everything else around you will outstrip that society. And so how to strike that balance between ultimate values and what reality imposes on you. And reality is never quite adequate, but ultimate values are too absolute because they demand a degree of imposition on others. How to strike that balance is maybe given to us as our insoluble problem to keep our motivation at the appropriate level.
Isn't that quite interesting? Isn't that also the story of American foreign policy? You have this. You've always argued that there's this set of ideals that America wants to live up to.
It's a special problem for America, because we have been as close as it is possible to be satisfied with where we are. And we've been protected by two great oceans, because whenever a society in almost every place else was tempted to be excessively satisfied with itself, its neighbors intruded on them. It was very difficult to do that in America because of these oceans. But after World War II, and now increasingly so, and now with artificial intelligence, totally so, we are part of an international or global system, and it goes beyond international, it goes beyond its universal system. And we have simultaneously to adjust to that and conduct a day-to-day policy with countries that have the same situation, and with other countries that grow up to our level of achievement that's never existed before in history.
You've always said America should balance a sort of shining city on a hill complex with reality, and you look at the last Cold War, and America won it by kind of singing a song of liberty, of those ideals, but also by doing really basic things, helping people, the Marshall Plan and things like that. If you go to America's allies, they will say America doesn't talk about those ideals any longer. It just talks about America first. And in terms of trade deals and things like that, America isn't, it's not even doing trade deals with its allies in either Asia or Europe. So that America, in a strange way, is more disconnected from what it should be than it has been.
Well, actually, in fact, America is not more disconnected. It's probably more connected than it's been in what is considered the great period of American history, except that during the Marshall Plan, at the end of World War II, all this was new. So it was a new experience, and it was therefore, it became very significant in day-to-day thinking of policymakers. Now policymakers are torn between, and at that time we had over 50% of the world's gross national product. Now we are down to about 24%, which is still a huge percentage, and still a extremely influential percentage. But it requires us to be more discriminating. So it looks as if we are retrenching. The problem that bothers me is not basically the retrenching, but we have not yet found a concept that unifies Americans. And so now the advocacy of the realization that we need a new idea for world order has shrunk to a much smaller group than existed at the end of World War II. Our challenge is conceptual more than practical.
When you came to power, America had a long period where it had been able to lecture the world. America was going through great difficulties then. It was going through things. You had the gas price. You had all these things going wrong, And America didn't. You had to scramble. You had to try and find allies. You had to try and make things work. You've had another period, from the Berlin Wall onwards, where America seemed very strong. Now again, it's stuck having to make allies, having to find balances. Is there a comparison there at all?
We now are living in a world of unprecedented complexity. The need for allies exists, but what allies are supposed to do in given circumstances and how the alliances are supposed to operate when every issue has a global component, but not every issue has a comparable interest for every country, so that countries, they all have a global interest in global stability, but they don't have the same interest in the immediate situation. Secondly, there has now, when I was given the opportunity to participate in policy making, that was essentially the 70s and early 80s. All these issues we're discussing were beginning were in their infancy, and so that their very existence was in dispute. And one of the contributions of Nixon was that he was willing to face these new realities. But now they're upon us, and in that sense, there is an evolution of the problems, as you suggest in your question.
Do you think now America is a worse ally? I mean, if I go to Paris or I go to Jakarta, they will say, all we hear from America is we hear America first, and we hear we don't want to do trade deals, we don't want to do things with you. There is no sense of reaching out, and they would probably say that Joe Biden is a little bit more polite than Donald Trump.
I would say,
but they're more helpful.
The debate within America has shifted to the extremes. So the difference between, say, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the 70s and 80s was about the degree of a participation in which they both shared. In the present period, the debate had shifted to extremes in which there is an extreme theory of America first, which is applied on both sides, but in such a way that it focuses too much on American interests and not on global interests. That is a challenge. But anyone who wants to conduct a serious American foreign policy must balance the two, or America will become isolated.
Do you think the current administration is doing a serious job at that?
I think the current administration is trying to do a serious job of that, but it is so afraid of attacks on itself that it doesn't do itself justice.
You were a Rockefeller Republican. Nowadays, there are no Rockefeller Republicans. There's Democrats on one extreme, and there's Republicans on the other. This center of American politics, the fact it's disappeared, do you think that has dramatic foreign policy implications?
I think that center still exists, but it doesn't have an articulate expression yet.
Would you ever like to see an independent party in America?
Well, independent parties in America have not had a good fate, yes. But I do think it is important to maintain an argument for the philosophy that I have maintained, not because I've maintained it, but because it reflects the necessity of our period. And that becomes magnified if you consider that we are now in the field of artificial intelligence at the very beginning of a colossal transformation of human consciousness, which will have to be built into this foreign policy.
But we have a paradox, don't we? You have these issues. You have artificial intelligence, you have climate change, you have maybe the global economy, where interconnectedness is incredibly important, but America doesn't seem to follow it.
That is in the current world. But the essence of what I'm concerned about is that we have opened the door to a dialogue with objects and with machines. That when the printing press was invented, it transformed the human consciousness and set off what we call now the Enlightenment, which has been going on for 500 years. Now these machines, what is the essence of these machines? We ask a question of these machines. These machines are then capable of encompassing all the knowledge that we have taught them, but that we cannot contain in one brain or one machine. Look at it, give us an answer, and we act on the basis of that. That is a new reality that will be studied for decades, like the old new reality was when the printing press permitted exchanging information easily.
But the printing press was at a time of nation states, or where nation states were coming to the fore, where you had an immediate need to interact with other ones. It was part of what appeared. AI is coming part, as you described, in America, which doesn't have borders.
No, but I think America will be driven by reality into studying and so will all other countries. It's not an American thing, but it's become a high-tech thing. So therefore, it will be a dialogue between, therefore the dialogue between America and China will become more important, even more crucial. But it will change the way we interpret reality, because due to our achievement, we have found the key to a new aspect of reality which we didn't know existed.
One last thing on America. Given the huge complexity of what you've described, do you think that a presidential election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump offers somebody who is capable of dealing with that degree of complexity?
It's going to be very difficult. It's a painful question. We have to live with what exists. And we mustn't turn our disputes into civil wars.
Been so used to the fact that every time there's a problem, central banks come and ease. This has been the kind of playbook, throughout my career, before that, after I left. Now we're in a very different environment. Central banks actually have to create a recession, in essence, to get back to price stability. So it's a complete reversal of the modus operandi, in a sense, of central banks as they've known it for the last several decades. So that's why it's not so much that they're getting something wrong. They've now acknowledged that there is this trade-off, these costs to pay, but it's a completely different way of thinking about central banks, and it's a different role. Another way to put it is they have to be unpopular now in order to get inflation back down, where it used to be you could count on them each time to rescue you, to stabilize the system, to bring support. And that has shifted. And I think many people, even in the markets, have not quite understood, in my mind, how much we are now in a different regime compared to the last 4 decades, effectively.
So it's what, almost an easing bias in the markets? How would you describe it?
In the U.S., yes. And I think it's this idea, this almost pre-programmed idea, when there is a problem, i.e. potential recession, central banks will come and ease.
Okay, so you're moving in on me, quick, distracting me with your fancy hands. I'm going to deal with your knight because this is really bothering me.
Ah, my knight.
Yeah, he's a troublemaker.
Yeah.
What did you get up to this weekend?
You know, just robot stuff. A lot of chess. I was practicing for you. I know you're pretty good. Ooh, I don't like that. I will take this. Put it over here.
Not cool. Not cool. All right, I will concede. I can see you've got me beat.
Very good game. Well played.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
There are so many factors at play today.
It remains tight in certain parts of the economy.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Crisis is too strong a word, and words like that get used a lot.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
America's economy needs a diversity of institutions. That's something that Wall Street pays a lot of attention to.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The third part of our conversation centered on Asia, perhaps the place where Kissinger has had the most enduring impact. For most people now, that impact is represented by China, which Kissinger and Richard Nixon helped open up to the West. But his first encounter with Asia, and the area of his life his critics focus on, was Indochina. I put it to Kissinger that although Nixon and he plainly inherited a mess in Vietnam in 1968, by 1975, North Vietnam had taken control of Saigon, and Cambodia, which America had bombed, was a disaster. I asked him whether, from the perspective now of nearly 50 years, there was anything he would have done differently.
I honestly believe we did the best we could. We inherited a war in which 550,000 Americans, no, 500,000 were in place, and 50,000 more had already been ordered to go there and were on the way to go there. In America, public opinion had turned in a significant way against the war, and in violent demonstrations in the streets among the international public. Everybody was against the war, but they also were for America defending them. So our credibility around the world depended, as it does today, on our ability to perform the tasks we had assigned ourselves. We have comparable problems today in issues in Taiwan and elsewhere, Ukraine. So our decision was to try to end the war under conditions in which the control over their own destiny fell more and more into the hands of the South Vietnamese. We gradually withdrew our troops, conducted negotiations, but also conducted enough military operations so that our adversary, now quasi-ally, but our then adversary did not become convinced that he could take over. We did not want what later was an Afghanistan-style withdrawal, which was for 2,500 people. We had 550,000 people, plus 1 million armed Vietnamese in place. So was it at every stage conducted with the absolutely, was there a better way at any one point? We didn't think so. I still don't think so, but I'm open to that argument, but what is meant by better? We reduced American casualties substantially so that by the last year of the war, they were in the thousands. When the Nixon administration came in, they were reduced to less than 100 in the last year of the war. And we withdrew from ground combat within 2 years. At all times, maintaining a negotiation. The irreducible demand we had was an autonomous democratic government in South Vietnam. That was not granted until the last 3 months of the war, which is why they were the last 3 months of the war. At that point, we settled. But then the next question became, could we maintain the settlement? We believed that we could maintain the settlement as we did in South Korea against all but an all-out invasion from the north, at which point alliance issues would have arisen. But we believed against foreseeable infiltrations, we could maintain the autonomy of the government, and we could maintain it against even significant attacks. But then Watergate occurred within 2 months of the settlement, and the Congress, reflecting public opinion, forbade any kind of military action in, over, and near Vietnam. At that point, it had destroyed the bases. It was painful. It was the saddest moment of my public life when I had to sit in the security advisor's office and recommend the final withdrawals. And I published in my memoirs conversations with President Ford to show how painful he found it to agree to these recommendations. I think the time we gained enabled us, by the time the war was ended, we had already opened to China. And that, in turn, what China had opened to us, either way. But that was the crucial turning point of the Cold War. And also created a structure from which we could have maintained, or at least given the Vietnamese a reasonable chance. During the debates and the pressures, many things were said that can now be used to indicate different views, but this was our essential views. And I'm sure that any later books that are written on the subject that have access to material will see that this was what we thought and acted on.
Just very quickly on that, you think in the end justified all the collateral damage of hanging on there?
No, the end for us, the end we were aiming for was an honorable peace. By honorable peace, we meant a peace in which we did not turn over the people who had relied on us to the domination of those whom they had fought relying on our promises. That was our definition of the end. We honestly believed that we had achieved that. And in presenting his proposal, the North Vietnamese negotiator Lee Duc Tho, the crucial point was in October 1972, when the North Vietnamese negotiated, turned over a proposal, and then read it to us and said, this is essentially what President Nixon had proposed in January. At that point, I asked for a recess. And my closest associate at that point was a man called Winston Lord, who went on to a distinguished career. And he had thought of resigning at the time we fought in Cambodia. And I told him then, you have two choices. You can go outside and walk around with a placard, or you can help end this war. And so at that moment, I turned to Winston, who was just Americans at that point, and I turned to him and I said, we've done it. Turned out to be a sad statement because we hadn't, because we could not maintain the domestic support that was needed to sustain it. But the effort, if the effort had not been made, and if we had gone to either of the other extreme solutions, one of which was to go all out upon coming into office before the ground had been laid with Russia and China, or to withdraw unconditionally and try to extricate hundreds of thousands of troops while the enemy was still around them in the form, and the local people might have turned against us, was not acceptable. And there were no other terms that could have been negotiated. That was the reality that we faced. And so, in retrospect, President Nixon came to believe, and actually, I thought already at that time we should have considered a more all-out military solution at the beginning. But on reflecting about it, at the time we had had assassinations in America and already violent demonstrations. that was probably more theoretical than practical. So that was our thinking. Of course, that will always be debated.
The other bit which you mentioned as being in part a reason why staying there made sense was China. From that point of view, you went there, you opened up.
It was important for us to show we entered office convinced that a country of the magnitude of China and the history of China could not be kept out of the international system, and that we could not keep it out of the international system, that it would find a way to enter it. And so we began efforts to open relations. At that moment, China had withdrawn all its ambassadors from every country in the world except two, Poland and Egypt. And Poland was maintained in the Geneva Agreement of 1954 as a contact point between America and China. And negotiations began on a regular basis, that is, between the ambassadors. There were 162 meetings between 1954 and 1971. None lasted more than a day, because each began with the Chinese demanding the immediate return of Taiwan to China, and with the Americans demanding that China affirm its commitment to a peaceful evolution of the process. Neither demand was accepted, and so we began from that basis, and then went through many contortions to establish contact and exploring many ways of possibly doing it, and finally found a way when President Nixon told Yaqub Khan in Pakistan that we wanted contact, that to convey to the Chinese that we wanted a real dialogue. And we emphasized it by sending an ambassador in Poland, the ambassador in Poland, to approach the Chinese ambassador at any social function to which all ambassadors were invited, which turned out to be a Yugoslav fashion show. One normally doesn't associate with Yugoslavia, but we approached him, and it was at that moment the ambassador, a few weeks later, drove up to our office, to our embassy, and said they were ready to begin negotiations. Those are the contortions through which things were conducted at the time. But from there, we worked together with China on the specific problem of enabling a dialogue which gave Russia something additional to think about, and then led to the easing of the Cold War and the culmination of the Vietnamese agreements, and to subsequent evolution of Chinese-American relations.
There's always a metaphor where I think the first time you said we were in the foothills of a new Cold War, and then we went up to the mountain passes, then the world was on a precipice looking over. But each time we talk, the relationship between America and China seems to be worse. Is that true today?
I'd say we are now at the top of the precipice. And one of the big problems is both sides need to step back from it simultaneously. If one of them steps back, it risks falling. So both have to decide to take the tension out of the situation. But there is an inherent difficulty in that relationship. China has been a great country for much of its history, but in the period that prior to the resumption of relations, in the terms of measuring power, China was much weaker than the United States. Its capacity was to stir up difficulty all over the world by using its diplomatic and potential commercial influence. As China grew in strength, which was inherent in opening the relationship, it gained the capacity of threatening the United States in the nature of modern technology. And the nuclear age, from the beginning, raised the issue that countries developing nuclear weapons and the capacity to deliver them were able to inflict the amount of damage that would normally require years of warfare, so that therefore their capacity to influence actions by threats grew. That was the dilemma of the nuclear age to begin with. And it was one reason why many of us thought negotiations for the reduction of that threat were important. So, with respect to Chinese-American relations, as China grew stronger, and as the American debate became more complicated, as we've discussed earlier, and as the Chinese governments changed over the years, the tension became harder and harder to manage. And on the American side, it became a subject which it had not been of domestic politics, so that candidates are now influenced by the degree to which their opponents can accuse them of selling out to China. So that is the current problem. However, and it is a unique situation in the sense that the biggest threat of each country is the other. That is, the biggest threat to China is America in their perception. And the same is true here. That the biggest threat. On the other hand, wars have become either unwinnable with the advanced weapons or winnable only at costs that are out of proportion. And so I support efforts to negotiate with China, and I've been urging them.
There's one interesting thing you said. You pointed out that in America, that politics has changed because successive leaders and in elections, people fight. In China, you've had one leader. You've had Xi Jinping now for over 10 years. So the fact that it's got worse in China, is that his fault? Has he gone in the wrong direction?
Well, what he has done is the so-called wolf diplomacy, in which Chinese diplomats were urged, in effect, to throw around their weight. So in relations with, say, Australia, which of a dramatic reduction of Chinese trade because of some political and other statements that had been made. It's a problem a little bit comparable to what we discussed before about Germany before 1914, that Germany suddenly became a great power, and after Bismarck, its first chancellor, did not know how to apply it in a way that translated into diplomatic results.
You described Deng Xiaoping, for instance, as a great man. Do you think of Xi Jinping as a great man?
Well, Deng Xiaoping had finished his destiny or his role.
Yeah.
Xi came in after a cultural revolution which wiped out many of these experienced leaders. And I don't describe him now as a great man, but I think he's pursuing goals which might earn him that title and the American president if they achieve a real balancing of relationship between the two countries.
What chances do you see of an invasion of Taiwan sometime in the next 3-4 years on the current trajectory of relations?
Well, on the current trajectory of relations, I think some military conflict is probable. But I also think the current trajectory of relations must be altered. And for the weeks preceding our discussion, there have been signs on both sides of trying to end them. They have not yet actually engaged in the sort of dialogues that I suggested, but I think they're moving towards it. And I leave my mind open in relation to the outcome.
The other thing which has happened is that China has got more involved in things beyond its traditional region. You know, you've seen China talking to Zelensky. You saw China brokering a kind of truce between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
It should be an inevitable part of these discussions that both sides explain to each other what their core interests are and determine how to handle situations in which their core interests clash. And I would hope to resolve interests in which core interests clash without conflict, or manage to avoid situations of clashing core interests.
At the moment, you have India, which seems to be a non-aligned country. It is not on one side or the other. Would a younger Kissinger now focus from an American point of view of trying to bring India, which will be the next great power, onto the American side?
I've not dealt with India in terms of years, even longer than I've dealt with China. And at the early period of my dealing with India, their non-alignment was a source of considerable irritation because it took the form of lecturing us on the virtues of non-alignment. That choice was open to them, but not to us. When you are in a Cold War, you can't retreat from it and say you're now going to choose non-alignment. But in the decades which I've dealt with India since, I think their policy, their current policy, is extraordinarily thoughtful. And I have great respect for their foreign minister, who is a very, I would say, brilliant executor of that policy. India is a great power, and over the decades ahead, it will grow very comparably to China. Maybe not quite to the same strength, but it doesn't matter at that point exactly. It will be of sufficient strength to assert itself. And so it performs best when it defends its own interests, which overlap many of ours. Our interests as a great power are to prevent any country from dominating the world or its regions in such a way that we lose our influence to achieve important objectives.
One of the ones we're working on at the moment is how do we charge back into Ukraine as soon as the European authorities say it's safe to fly in Ukraine again. Now, nobody knows when that is going to be. But we were Ukraine's second largest airline when the Russians invaded on the 24th of February last year. We would be Ukraine's biggest airline the week after they tell us it's safe to go back in there, because we're going to charge back in there. Initially, we have a plan to open up about 30 routes from 4 Ukrainian airports back into the European Union. And then we want to, I think, within 6 to 12 months, open up 3 or 4 large bases in Ukraine. And we're talking to the Ukrainian authorities about creating an environment cost agreement on which we could lead the charge of air travel into a post-war Ukrainian recovery.
The final part of our conversation focused on legacy and the personal side. Henry Kissinger has remained a pretty private person. In an age where leaders like to play on emotional narratives, he has, as we shall shortly see, tended to suppress his backstory, even when it might win him sympathy. One constant in the 3 decades that I've known him has been football. His first question on seeing me was why had Leicester City, my football team, just been relegated from the Premier League. He has followed Firth, which itself got relegated from the Bundesliga last year, since he was a boy. Indeed, he and his brother were beaten up by Nazi thugs for trying to sneak into a game. You have lived 100 years, and Firth is yet to win the Bundesliga. How long would you have to live for that to happen?
It would come close to the definition, to giving us a definition of infinity.
I've read a lot of things you've written, and nothing quite as sort of powerful as this. And it was in Neil Ferguson's book. It was a a private essay you wrote when you visited Arnhem concentration camp when you were aged, I think, just 22. And especially you meet this inmate called Folek Sama, and you say, Folek Sama, your foot has been crushed so that you can't run away. Your face is 40. Your body is ageless, yet all your certificate reads as 16. And I stand there with my clean clothes and make a speech to you and your comrades. Folek Sama, humanity stands accused in you. I, Joe Smith, human dignity, everybody has failed you. You should be preserved in cement up here on the hillside for future generations to look upon and take stock. Human dignity, objective values have stopped at this barbed wire. As long as conscience exists as a conception in the world, you must personify it. Nothing done for you will ever restore you. You are eternal in this respect. Obviously had a very profound experience in you, but it's something you chose to keep sort of private for a long time. Do you think that's a different way of people seeing Henry Kissinger?
It was a feeling that this concentration camp evoked in me. I wrote that within a week of having seen a level of dehumanization that we can't imagine, that people were too weak to hurt the guards that had kept them. And we killed some people by mistake by giving them solid food. So I wrote that for myself. I had no intention of publishing it because feelings about humanity can affect your own actions. A biographer discovered it. Not among papers I gave him, but it reflects an underlying reality that we have to recognize as lurking behind our technical capacities, and that we need to contain and prevent from breaking, and to use to prevent the barbaric side from breaking out.
When you look back at your life now from the 100-year point of view, do you think that has been the core of it, is trying to do that?
It's been an important core of it, but I don't advertise it.
On that thing, I know you're 100. You're talking about writing 2 more books, but how if not for that, how would you like to be remembered?
It's out of my control. I try to do the best I could within the framework that we have discussed.
Henry Kissinger, thank you very much for talking to Bloomberg. A very delayed happy birthday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What do you like most about your job?
I think the people. I mean, ultimately, we're a people business. A lot of what my job is as CEO of the company is to give those people sort of motivation, to tell them where we're going, to encourage them to come up and do their best work, to encourage them to collaborate. Sometimes you sort of think you're almost a psychologist, as you are a business leader, I think, sometimes.
And so what's your best piece of advice?
I love pitches. I love being sort of leading from the front, if you like, and spending times with teams. I love to see the work that we're doing. When we pitch for a piece of new business, often when we come together. So I guess I try and put myself in the seat of the client. Now, what's the client going to think when they see this work? Are they going to be excited? Is it going to turn their brand around? How's it going to resonate with their consumers? So as much as possible, I think probably I try and play that role.
Paul Jacobson assured me that when he takes the new Hummer EV on long journeys, it's not just fun to drive, it's equipped to go the distance.
I hear so much about road trip anxiety that I wanted to experience it myself. My family likes to drive a lot, so I brought my daughter home from college in this, and it was great. I mean, the computer system is all intuitive. It tells you how to keep track of the battery. It tells you where the charging stations are. It tells you how much power you'll have when you get to the charging station. So it really puts a lot of your anxiety at ease. But as far as driving it's a treat.
So where are you on the charging stations? I know General Motors has made an investment in one company. How are we doing in this country generally in getting charging stations in?
So I think this is an area where obviously we can continue to improve as a country and a society. We're doing our best. We've committed almost $1 billion to EV charging. So we've taken that and looked at home charging solutions, local community solutions, and road trip charging solutions. With my daughter, what we would end up doing is probably stopping, grabbing a bite to eat, plugging it into a charger, usually a high-speed charger, to get as much charge as we can, and being there for 20 to 30 minutes. Get us a lot of range, and by the time we've used that range, we're tired, ready to stop again, etc. So it was a really good experience for me, and it's taught me, number one, what are the concerns of the consumer that are ultimately going to drive our vehicles, and then number two, where do we need to focus on addressing some of those anxious points for people?
The moment news breaks, no one covers the world like Bloomberg.
On the AI question, what we don't really see is Apple doing a knee-jerk response and moving into the domain of generative AI.
Supporters of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan celebrating late into the night, dancing and singing.
We have a fundamental reassessment of everybody's capacity within OPEC. Should we talk about $95 and $100 oil again? Not for a while.
Bloomberg, your global business authority. This June, in honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month.
Patient, resilient, persistent. Anwar Ibrahim's rise to the pinnacle of Malaysian politics is the story of a man who waited decades. Anwar was first identified as the future Prime Minister more than 25 years ago, but fell from favor, sent to jail twice on sodomy charges. Now at 75, he finds himself forced into a coalition with a party he blames for sending him to prison. A party mired in corruption, whose leader, his deputy Prime Minister, has been charged with almost 50 counts. Add to that the ongoing fallout from the 1MDB scandal, the rising cost of living and increased poverty, and the road ahead will be as hard to navigate as that which has passed. This is the first international interview with Malaysia's new Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg Television.
Thank you, Zinda.
Your political journey has been extraordinary, to say the least. You were touted as the future Prime Minister of the country from as far back as 1997. More than 20 years on, how does it feel to finally be the Premier?
Well, waiting in the corridors of power is, of course, an experience by itself, because you observe the players. It's like King Lear with Cordelia, looking at the stage, and you learn from the strengths and weaknesses of your foes. And hopefully when you are in office, you try and improve and do your best to serve.
What did you learn while you observed?
Well, you learn how a country can improve or excel or succeed, and the flaws that can weaken the fabric and destroy the nation. So I think what we need to do is to regain that trust and be seen and honestly attempt to do the right thing.
You've inherited a nation that's so divisive. You saw the first hung parliament, a country tainted by the long-standing 1MDB scandal. How do you regain credibility? How do you regain investor confidence?
Well, it's just not one MDB, but this corruption is systemic, as I've said, which means it cuts across whole spectrum of particularly the political elite. And therefore, you have to set a good example. I don't think people are, generally quite critical, but they also expect change. They're also fed up with the situation. Malaysia shouldn't be known for its financial scandals or malfeasance. It should be known for its vibrant multiracial, multireligious society, for its capacity to move forward.
No more corruption, you say, and that is a pledge you've made over and over again. Yet here you are, tied up with Barisan Nasional, whose party chief faces multiple charges. I mean, is there a disconnect there? How do you reconcile your ideals and your actions?
Well, he has been investigated and charged and undergoing trial, and the court should decide independently. And I made very clear that the courts are independent, and I don't think I should prejudge the case.
But this is a man who faces 47 counts of corruption. He is your deputy prime minister.
Fair, I'm not here to discuss his case. I'm here to suggest that the court process must be independent, and he must be given a chance, the fairness, to be adjudicated by an independent, impartial court. But you have to form a government, a viable, strong government. As long as the policy is accepted and no more excesses, I think fine. I should be given a chance to conduct this. Whom do I choose? I choose Party B or C in the opposition, who are also very badly tainted, whether they use a modern suit or Malay songkor or religious garb. They're about the same when it comes to poor governance and endemic corruption.
Prime Minister, what if you lose your deputy prime minister? What if Zahid Hamidi is found guilty, sent to prison? What is the option? What is plan B? And what if Barisan Nasional pulls out, withdraws its support? Its support has been crucial to you becoming prime minister.
We'll cross the bridge.
What is plan B?
For
what
now,
if that happens?
why do you prejudge a case? I went through this process. I don't think it is fair to prejudge the case. Let us move on. But for now, I happen to be also Minister of Finance. All the procedures, financial procedures come under me. There's not one trace I can find from any of my team now trying to squander through contracts or projects. And I am fine with that. People should judge me from the last 2 months.
Prime Minister, needless to say, Malaysian politics is known for the backstabbing, a revolving door of foes and friends. Hence, the question of how stable your government really is. We have Barisan Nasional, the party that sent you pretty much to jail for what you described as trumped-up charges. How do you trust your coalition?
How do I trust? First, malice towards none. All right? There are many who were complicit to the crimes perpetrated against me. I said, I want to move on. Right? I cannot save the corrupt because when they steal from the public purse, it is therefore my duty to make sure the funds are returned to the people. That's it. So whether there's backstabbing, tell me in political system there was not any backstabbing, where you learn from what, Somalia or Pakistan or United States or the UK. What is important is there are no indication, no signs, except the desperate voices of the opposition, being more racist, so-called more Islamic in a very extremist manner. But I think otherwise, policies are accepted. I mean, what's important in the government is stable, yes. Is the policy made clear? Yes. And I think we should move on in that direction.
You talked about the rise of political Islam, and we suddenly saw that at the last election. Growing voices urging for a more hardcore, conservative brand of Islam in Malaysia. Are you worried? How are you navigating it?
any Malaysian, a decent citizen, would be worried any trend towards racism or religious bigotry. I am not against Islamic ideals. I'm not against even Islam in politics, but I reject this notion of using religion as so-called an alim, a scholar, using religion to fortify your strength and abuse that position. And when you are criticized, you can't be criticized because you are a great alim. This is not how Islam works, okay? You have to accept the reality in Malaysia. Yes, we should be practicing Muslims, but we are human beings. What is religion without care and compassion? What is religion without humanity? So we will have to fight them, and we will have to confront them. And I think ultimately, reason will prevail. The complicity of the international finance institutions, including particularly Goldman Sachs, is there. Otherwise, 1MD wouldn't have happened. And I think Goldman Sachs should come out clean and deal with Malaysia.
Politics.
We're not going to be relying upon countries whose values we don't share.
To the world of business.
It's all about corporate power in the end.
Balance of Power. Live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters.
We couldn't be more excited what's in store for you.
How long will it take? How many years? Why don't we take this one day at a time?
Good luck. Everybody has a perspective.
Every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Join host Anne-Marie Hordern.
It's the one area, really, of bipartisanship.
I think we're getting more of it.
That's optimistic.
And Joe Matthew.
The debt ceiling is looming. How close are we going to get to the line before you start to worry?
Alongside Kaylee Lines.
The door was open for regulators to do more, and that puts the Fed between a rock and a hard place.
As they deliver news.
This is such an important economic issue.
He's no longer trying to run away from
that. Really blew some minds.
Insight.
We can both invest in law enforcement and also make sure that communities feel safe in their own skin.
And analysis.
I think your audience will get this more than most.
This is not the Republican Party that you know.
It allows him to do what he did so successfully in 2020, which is run against crazy.
From and about politics' biggest power players.
This was the zombie case, and it's now more than well alive.
That's for sure, with two more potentially to come.
I'm willing to have this battle.
It is vitally important. This is the intersection of Washington and Wall Street.
Bringing people directly to the decision makers that impact your investments and your life.
Balance of Power, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Prime Minister, let's turn to the economy. You're inheriting an economy that is struggling with higher inflation. What's the biggest challenge you face in getting the economy back on track?
I reiterate the point, the first thing that any government should do, and particularly in my administration, is good governance, is democratic accountability. If you have a system, very clear policies to encourage investments, there's ease of doing business, fast, efficient, and not corrupt. Investors will come in.
The previous government set a target of 5.5% for the fiscal deficit. Are you likely to maintain that?
We will have to gradually reduce deficit, but it should not be at the expense of public welfare. I mean, the poor, education, health. So we have to navigate this very carefully. We are fortunate that the revenue from taxes has increased slightly, and of course, from petroleum and gas also have increased. But our policy in terms of reducing this deficit must continue.
There is a GDP target as well of 4 to 5%. Is that a target you will maintain?
Well, I'm more realistic. Economics is about facts and data and confidence. We are quite comfortable from the results of the fourth quarter. And though the projections have been more negative next year, I've seen these sort of more positive changes in the last few months, and I hope we can sustain that. So what is being projected will be announced at that particular time.
4 to 5% is achievable then?
I would say somewhere around that.
Is China's reopening a boon or a bane? Do you see China contributing to the growth in Malaysia?
Certainly, China is an important neighbor, it's a big neighbor, it is a rich neighbor relative to our society and our country, and the potential of economic growth is huge, enormous from China. But at the same time, the Malaysian policy is very clear. We want investments from the neighbors and from all over the world. And that would secure our stability and future.
How about in terms of the debt ceiling? We know that the previous government raised the debt ceiling to 65%. Might you do the same? Might you raise it to even more, 70% of GDP?
No. Our thinking is that we have reached the ceiling and we should gradually go down. Otherwise, it's irresponsible to the next generation.
The 1MDB crisis is a story that keeps on giving. We know that Goldman has publicly alleged that Malaysia has undervalued the assets already retrieved by Malaysia. What's your response to that?
Well, I've said before, the complicity of the international finance institutions, including particularly Goldman Sachs, is there. Otherwise, 1MD wouldn't have happened. So we are entering into negotiations. I would suggest that 1MDB be reasonable with us, pay what's due, and negotiate the terms. I don't think they should be too preemptive in trying to suggest that they will not honor because of the deals that we have made in the past. This is a crime not only to me or the government, but to ordinary Malaysians. So that would be my response to the issue of Goldman Sachs.
How much does Goldman Sachs still owe Malaysia? Are we looking at 250 million as suggested before?
Well, that's the present sort of arrangement. I would want to see a more responsible response from Goldman Sachs so that we can end this. I mean, it is a big institution. It has its strength. There are some positive issues with them, but there are also huge problems in the past. And I don't think I would want to venture into that. But my only appeal is for them to make settle this deal with Malaysia, because 1MDB is known throughout the world. It is there in the books. And I think Goldman Sachs should come out clean and deal with Malaysia. And don't think that you can, dismiss this as something small that you can just use your strength to dictate your terms.
But Prime Minister, Goldman says that Malaysia is intentionally undervaluing the assets to force Goldman to pay the 250 interim payment.
If you want me to pursue that, I would say that given a fair deal, we were supposed to be paid much more than that, okay? Which I intend to then deal with them if these things is not settled amicably. That's why I've said it's not my intention. I'm just new in the game. I just want to settle old scores. I mean, not old scores in the sense that whatever old commitments that we have made, we have to move on. If they come to, for example, pressure us on this, I will have no choice because I have a mandate for my people. you know, and people are struggling to live. And you with the hundreds and billions of profit and squandering, you can't just get away and by ignoring your moral responsibility and what is termed as financial responsibility.
How much of the assets linked to 1MDB has been recovered, and how has it been used?
Well, it is still in the process. We are still negotiating. I've asked committees after committees reopening the case and trying to get back as much as possible. It is horrendous sort of problem that we have to deal with, but how much you can get, I frankly can't say for now, but there's much more that we should be able to do. And I just hope that friendly governments throughout the world must act responsibly. It's not fair, you know, because of the excesses of a few, then you have the whole country having to deal with this problem.
In a multipolar world, where does Malaysia sit between the US and China?
As a small trading nation, we should sit smartly, be a great friend of China and a great friend of the United States.
Do you think there's much oil to be found in the lower 48 at this point, or even in, let's say, Alaska as well, or mostly we know where all the oil is, and there's no more big Permian Basin kind of deposits anywhere?
People have said that over time, and then we've always been surprised. And so the U.S. has been explored more than any other place in the world. I think the industry has a good idea, but technology allows you sometimes to recover things that you haven't been able to before. That's the story of shale. The other one that continues to be a positive story is deepwater Gulf of Mexico, where we'll go out and drill in a mile or more of water depth and then go down several more miles and find large fields. And the Gulf of Mexico is still relatively underexplored compared to the onshore. So I think there's still room for more discoveries.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
The transactions.
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
And the technology.
Stop talking about the technology, start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays. Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite, positioning companies to meet the next generation of challenges, breaking out of traditional roles.
One of the most important things is looking around the corner.
Look for Chief Future Officer on Bloomberg.
Let's talk about geopolitics. They've been making headlines of late. In a multipolar world, where does Malaysia sit between the US and China?
As a small trading nation, we should sit smartly, be a great friend of China and a great friend of the United States. Don't assume that we are another superpower to try and resolve that problem. I think what we need to do is just be a great friend and engage with them. If we are asked, then we, of course, give our views. But as an independent country, we should exercise our right to express our views. But bottom line, be a friend to China as a great neighbor and America because of their huge potential to invest.
Is there a sense that there is too much competition against China?
We don't have that problem. It's not Malaysia's problem. It may be a US problem or some countries. We don't have that problem. we would use our potential and our whatever little influence to try and engage with everyone. And we also express in private some of our concerns against China or United States for that matter, but then overall we want to remain good friends to both.
Who should bear the bulk of the responsibility for the rising antagonism between the US and China?
Well,
how are you assessing it?
I don't necessarily need to assess that, because our hope is that there should be more engagement to resolve this outstanding problem, because the continued resentment and antagonism between these countries are affecting the smaller countries like Malaysia and ASEAN adversely. So it is to our interest and to the international community if they can have an amicable resolution to this tense relationship.
And speaking of smaller nations, Ukraine comes to mind, that war. Any lessons learned from the war in Ukraine for a country like Malaysia?
Is to make sure that we make peace and settle differences through negotiations and amicably, and which we have done so, although we have all problems, all normal problems with the neighbors, but never to the extent that it could be growing tension to invite sort of antagonism.
Has Malaysia been caught in this war, like other countries in the global south, being caught between the US on the one side and Russia and China on the other?
Not really, but we are caught in the sense that we are victims of this war, and because of the rising prices, the issue of animal feed, etc. So I think in that sense we are affected, but we are not. I mean, to be fair to both Russia and America, we have not been compelled to take sides in the sense that it will be to the detriment of Malaysia as a nation.
But as a prime minister of a country, do you see the need for perhaps President Zelensky to start negotiating earlier rather than later for the greater good of the world?
We have been consistently in favor of negotiations. However tough and difficult, you must never fear to negotiate.
Are you concerned that a lot of offensive weapons have made their way to Ukraine and that may end up badly, so to speak?
Well, war is something that nobody would welcome. I mean, I think it is of great concern to all, because innocent lives, women, children, are all affected in the war. So I think whether it escalates or not, our position is that they must negotiate to at least ease and ultimately end the war.
Prime Minister, to wrap up, what do you view as your biggest challenge as you look to the next 5 years as Prime Minister of Malaysia?
One is, I refer to the issue of democratic accountability. How can you ensure that the country mature as a democracy and clean the mess of corruption and abuse of power? And then to focus on economic development. And by economic development and sustainability, I mean the conservative environment, but also concern for the general masses, because policies have somehow been pursued at the expense of and marginalization of the majority who are poor, and allowing the gap between the very rich and the poor to continue. So I think these are challenges that we have to address. It's more complex, more challenging. I need the support of the entire team and the understanding of general Malaysians.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Asinta.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Okay, so you're moving in on me, quick. Distracting me with your fancy hands. I'm going to deal with your knight because it's really bothering me.
Ah, my knights.
Yeah, he's a troublemaker.
Yeah.
What did you get up to this weekend?
You know, just robot stuff. A lot of chess. I was practicing for you. I know you're pretty good. Ooh, I don't like that. I will take this. Put it over here.
Not cool. Not cool. All right. I will concede. I can see. You've got me beat.
Very good game. Well played.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Business Week Radio, live weekday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern.
We got a little bit of talking.
Come on, are you guys ready?
Harnessing the power of Bloomberg Business Week, Carol Masser and Tim Stanivek bring you the latest news from the worlds of business, technology, politics, and more.
How does the Fed play into this and what the Fed does potentially?
This is so exhausting and this is so all-encompassing.
Listen on Bloomberg Radio and streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals.
From New York City.
In London, in Sydney,
From Washington.
in Tokyo.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening. Here's what I'm watching. You do not want to miss this story.
Is there the kind of upside?
Every couple of years, mega sporting events like the World Cup and the Olympics give us a glimpse into the outer bounds of human performance. Surrounding that spectacle, quite literally, is an entirely different calculus: the decision to even put on the games in the first place. Once a highly sought role, hosting a mega event is now an entirely different proposition, one that politicians, governments, executives, and citizens are asking, is it worth it?
What is the change in tourism during the games and after the games? Controlling for other variables. What is the change in fiscal revenues? What is the change in employment? What is the change in GDP? And so on. We don't see these gains materializing.
There's some big numbers that go around for Qatar's spending on this tournament. I'm worried that the government will be surprised at how many people leave after the event is all over.
I can see why hosting the Olympics and bidding on the Olympics is attractive, but it absolutely comes with enormous long-term risks and costs.
After years of controversy and criticism, mega sporting events could be on the cusp of a new, more sustainable era.
When it comes to organizing the games, there must be a debate, and we've done a lot of reforms over the last decades to make sure that the games remain relevant.
But will the changes be enough to convince potential hosts? One city's example might offer a way forward.
We have the ability to really fit the games to our community, as opposed to have to fit the community to the games.
The first Winter World Cup, held in the compact, affluent state of Qatar, has drawn a massive number of people to the country.
Organizers are expecting some 1.2 million people will come to the country over the course of this month-long event. So you're essentially thinking roughly a 10% increase in population every night in the most busy parts of the tournament. Qatar's also really interested in developing a tourism economy. They've seen the success of Dubai, and even though this is a much more conservative country, they think that they can draw people here for other major sporting events, for conferences, just to visit on stopovers to other places. So they're hoping that some of the new hotels and new entertainment venues and the like that they've built for the World Cup can get used by the next generation of tourists.
Authorities estimate that hosting the World Cup could add as much as $17 billion into its economy. But in order to get to that point, the country has spent a massive amount of money over the past decade on infrastructure, including building an entirely new city.
There are various estimates of how much exactly Qatar has spent in order to prepare for this event. The stadiums are really just a small fraction.
While costs for the 2022 World Cup are reportedly the highest ever for a sporting competition, it's part of an unsettling trend for what are known as mega events.
Mega means big. Other than the day-to-day leagues, the NBA, the NFL, MLB, NHL, or the English Premier League, the day-to-day leagues where they have every couple of days, or if it's baseball, every single day they have a new game, that's standard economic issues. But if it's something where a lot of people are coming from out of town and there's one big event or there's one series of events like the Olympics is 17 days or the World Cup has traditionally been around 28 days, you're doing something special that doesn't normally happen and involves tens of thousands, if not millions of people, then we call that a mega event.
The first International Modern Olympics in 1896, held in Athens, was considered the first sporting mega event, the largest competition ever held up to that time. Although initially limited to male amateur competitors from only 14 countries, the Olympics have expanded significantly in size, scope, and inclusivity since. One key tradition that has persisted for the past century is that the Games travel every 4 years.
Every 2 years we have the Olympic Games and the Winter Olympic Games, which represent what the movement collectively does and bring the best of the sporting world together.
At the helm of the modern games is an organization called the International Olympic Committee, made up of delegates from participating nations. The IOC is responsible for choosing host cities and ensuring that the games are run in accordance with IOC rules.
The movement has evolved tremendously over more than a century. It has gone through many developments as sport in the end reflects society, and to remain relevant, this is a constant adaptation.
For the first half-century or so, the Games were a relatively low-budget affair. But beginning in the 1960s, the IOC and local planning committees began to see value in lucrative sponsorships and global television rights. As the potential rewards grew, so did the scale of the events, along with the cost to build infrastructure to host them. Those costs, however, are not fronted by the IOC. It's up to the host cities, who bid for a chance to reap the potential rewards. But is it worth it?
Somewhere between $4 and $6 billion of revenue will get generated by hosting the Summer Games in these days. On the expense side, it's much, much, much higher. That's not a good financial balance.
Projected costs for an event on an Olympic scale are expectedly high, but the real trouble cities can find themselves facing is when projected costs go substantially over budget, often forcing governments to absorb the overruns.
The University of Oxford in England has done a number of studies on costs and cost overruns. And what they have found is that since 1976, the average cost overrun, or the median cost overrun for the Summer Games, is 252%. So that means 3.52 times the initial bid.
The whole point about these studies is to constantly be aware that organizing an event like this is not a given. It's a constant strive to make sure that the games, when it comes to its economics, do balance.
What drives costs so exceedingly over budget for mega events? Well, it's partly due to optimism bias, in which planners simply assume things will cost less than they ultimately do. Promoters might even intentionally distort initial projections to help win over stakeholders. And by the time the mega event rolls around, there's simply no other option but to spend more.
If the Olympic Games are going to start on July 20th of a particular year, you can't call up and say, oh, gee, we need another 2 weeks. The Olympic Stadium won't be ready on July 20th. No, that can't happen. And so once you have that kind of a very firm, hard deadline in place, now the construction companies know that this has to be top priority, and they have to start shifting workers from other construction projects and shifting materials over there, and that gives them an excuse to bid up the prices still more. So you have all of these factors working together, and all of a sudden you're 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times higher than the initial bid.
Not surprisingly, enthusiasm for hosting the Games has varied over the years. For a period, the Games seemed cursed. From tragic violence around the 1968 Mexico City and 1972 Munich Summer Games, to a debt-ridden financial disaster in 1976 that Montreal spent the next 30 years paying off. More recently, enormous budget overruns, political controversies, and viral scenes of decaying stadiums in Athens, Rio de Janeiro, and Beijing have led some citizen activists to openly question the environmental impacts, political optics, and cost-benefit ratio of hosting.
One of the ones we're working on at the moment is how do we charge back into Ukraine as soon as the European authorities say it's safe to fly in Ukraine again. Now, nobody knows when that is going to be. But we were Ukraine's second largest airline when the Russians invaded on the 24th of February last year. We would be Ukraine's biggest airline the week after they tell us it's safe to go back in there, because we're going to charge back in there. Initially, we have a plan to open up about 30 routes from 4 Ukrainian airports back into the European Union. And then we want to, I think in the first, within 6 to 12 months, open up 3 or 4 large bases in Ukraine. And we're talking to the Ukrainian authorities about creating an environment cost agreement on which we could lead the charge of air travel into a post-war Ukrainian recovery.
Enjoy the excitement of a night of music at Boston Symphony Hall with BSO Now. Watch brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra performances, behind-the-scenes storytelling, and memorable archival concerts, all from the comfort of home. Use our free 24-hour trial and see why the Boston Globe calls it musically rewarding. And the Berkshire Edge says the orchestra has never played better. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsored by Bank of America.
Bloomberg UK, your source for news and analysis covering the biggest challenges facing the UK government, economy, financial services, and markets.
Tax cuts should not be the priority. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
In this post-Brexit world, how do you see actually servicing your clients?
It was disruptive, and it's going to have implications to how capital raising works.
Now we're having the perfect storm in the UK.
Watch Francine Lacqua Thursdays at 9:30 a.m. only on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Boston is an absolutely beautiful city. It looks great in the summertime. It looks great when you envision that helicopter or drone shot looking over a brand new stadium with fireworks going off and our gleaming skyline in the background and the Charles River on one hand and Boston Harbor on the other. It's really an impressive and gorgeous place. It's also on or in the most valuable time zone in the world. The East Coast time zone has something like 40 or 50% of all of the American television viewers.
Boston beats out Los Angeles, San Francisco, and D.C., and will be the U.S. bid in a worldwide battle for the 2024 games.
The polling was very clear that at first, residents of Greater Boston supported the Boston 2024 Olympic bid. The idea of the Olympics improving the public transportation system in Massachusetts was always the most appealing and enticing part. But what became clear is that over time, the more people learned about the implications of the bid, the risks and the costs, that they got beyond those glossy images and saw what it would really mean for their lives and for the future of the state, that people's support for the games dropped dramatically.
We see that the bid requires building the 3 most expensive Olympic venues, that every Olympics since 1960 has gone over budget.
We felt that there needed to be a real debate about whether the Olympics was the right thing for Massachusetts or not. And we saw that because of the power of the people pushing the bid, there were going to be very few institutions that would normally ask tough questions of the bid that were going to do that in this case. And so that opposition had to come from the grassroots, and that's why we formed No Boston Olympics. Boston 2024's original proposal was to put beach volleyball here in Boston Common, not a place that has sand, not a place along the water, and one of the most historic public spaces and important public spaces in the U.S. This is the original public park in North America. Boston was the first major city to stand up and say no to the summer 2024 games. But in the wake of our decision in Boston, other cities dropped out. Rome, Italy had been talking about bidding. A new mayor was elected there who said she had more important priorities than the Olympics, and so that bid died. Hamburg, Germany, actually had a public referendum to bid on the 2024 games and voted that down in November of 2015. Budapest, Hungary, there was a grassroots opposition to the games there that forced the question of the Olympics to be on the ballot, and eventually the organizers of the games there decided not to move forward with it.
In 2017, left with a dwindling set of potential hosts for the 2024 games, the International Olympic Committee made an unprecedented move. It awarded the two remaining contenders at the same time, Paris for 2024 and Los Angeles for 2028, giving the IOC some extra breathing room and a chance to focus on a series of reforms.
You have to listen to the critics as well. And we've been in contact with them and other opponents to the games, because this is our mission, to listen and to make sure that their analysis, we do understand why they reach these conclusions and what we can improve.
In the late 1970s, the IOC was in a similarly desperate position, facing backlash after a series of blemished events earlier in the decade. Sensing a rare opportunity for leverage, the city of Los Angeles decided that it could make the 1984 Olympics a success, but on its terms.
What happened in '84 was good for Los Angeles, it turned out, for some very interesting reasons. But it was a disaster because the IOC had to give up on many of its requirements. The IOC requires, for instance, that a host city guarantee that it will carry out all of the tasks in its contract and take full responsibility financially for any costs that are involved. In 1984, because Los Angeles was the only city that was bidding, the IOC basically was on its knees in front of the Los Angeles Committee saying, please, please do this. And so the Los Angeles Committee dictated terms, and one of the terms was, we're not going to be responsible for cost overruns.
By most accounts, the 1984 Los Angeles Summer Games were a resounding success. Instead of saddling taxpayers with a catastrophic loss, the games were actually profitable, thanks to strategic corporate sponsorships and manageable costs. Because the metropolitan area already had suitable stadiums, venues, and housing, very little new construction was needed, preventing the sort of surprise expenses that had plagued earlier host cities. And now, amid another challenging period for the Olympics, Los Angeles is again trying to rewrite the narrative.
We like to say that the LA '84 games are actually what gives us the ability to have such great public support here in Los Angeles for the games. You can't walk around this city and not meet somebody who has a positive memory of 1984. And that's really the starting place for us. We are a no-build games, and sometimes we like to say it's a part of our radical reuse philosophy around sustainability. The fact is, the best venues are the ones you don't have to build. Right over my shoulder, you can see one of the main pieces that will actually be the secret sauce of LA being able to host the Olympic Games, and that's UCLA. We have UCLA and USC within really just about 10 to 12 miles of each other. And really that's the beginning stages of infrastructure. But beyond that, we really have just an extraordinary number of venues here in LA and in greater Southern California, whether it's 3 facilities, 3 stadiums that are over 75,000 seats, multiple arenas, different types of facilities. And so we're just tailor-made to be able to actually host a mega sporting event like the Olympics and the Paralympics.
As for potential cost overruns, LA 28 has a plan in mind.
We actually are carrying a 10% contingency from day one in our budget in terms of how and what it is that we actually think about. And so we're trying to build against that contingency. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about everything that we do and think about it through the lens of sustainability. We'll have probably just shy of 100,000 jobs that will be a part of our journey over the next 6 years, and that's billions of dollars of economic impact directly to citizens of LA.
Beyond the raw cost-benefit figures, there is another value to the Olympics that is harder to measure.
For us, it's really about human legacy. And it starts actually with the kids that we want to be sitting in the stadiums thinking and dreaming that they too can be an Olympian or a Paralympian. As a part of our Play LA program, which is our $160 million investment into kids in Los Angeles, one of the real important parts of that is we've introduced adaptive sports into the Rex and Park program in the city of LA.
I'm optimistic about the 28 games for the same reasons. I think that they have really excellent management of the organizing committee, and they're Los Angeles. They've got a lot more stadiums now than they had back in 1984, and they've got more infrastructure, including public transportation, that they didn't have. So I think it'll turn out well.
How did Jeff Bezos realize you could sell anything on the internet?
The web was growing at something like 2,300% a year. Anything growing that fast is gonna be big.
Why did Bill Gates create Control-Alt-Delete?
Kind of become the poster child of, hey, couldn't you have made this stuff a little simpler?
And what inspired Diane von Furstenberg to create the wrap dress?
The wrap dress created me.
On the David Rubenstein Show, I uncover the untold stories of the world's most successful leaders, right here on Bloomberg.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's a question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions. A lot's happening on Wall Street.
There are so many factors at play today.
It remains tight in certain parts of the economy.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Crisis is too strong a word, and words like that get used a lot.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
America's economy needs a diversity of institutions. That's something that Wall Street pays a lot of attention to.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, there are places where costs simply aren't a major concern. But this path comes with its own set of problems.
The person who really seems to have wanted to host the World Cup more than anyone else is Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani. He's now known as the Father Emir. He was the former ruler of Qatar. And this was really his desire, not just to host, a massive football tournament. He knew that it would drive an enormous amount of development in the country, that Qatar really needed to become a kind of modern place.
And that's exactly what happened. In the last decade alone, Qatar has built more roads, bicycle paths, and bridges than during the entire previous half-century. Funded by a robust petroleum and natural gas-based economy, the government was less concerned with short-term profit and more interested in the long-term benefits of future tourism, business development, and global prestige. For instance, they've gone to great lengths, and no doubt expense, to show off cutting-edge engineering feats, such as this innovative stadium design constructed partly out of shipping containers, meant to be easily deconstructed and transported elsewhere. But the attention the nation has received has generally not been so positive.
Behind the scenes, many more are being exploited, unpaid, forced labor, badly treated.
It's very hard to give an exact figure. I would suspect it's actually in the hundreds. I think hundreds of workers have died to make this World Cup possible.
There was initially reports about the deaths of workers in stadium projects and other projects directly tied to the World Cup. This obviously set off an enormous international outcry, and ultimately the government did start making reforms in order to respond to this. So people were living in very cramped, unsafe, unsanitary accommodations. They've set minimum standards on that. They also introduced a universal minimum wage, meaning it applies to people of all nationalities. It's not much, it's about $274 a month, but it's something, and in fact, it's the first universal minimum wage across the Gulf region generally. Activists are not entirely happy with the reforms that Qatari government has made. They don't believe that some of these reforms have gone far enough. On worker deaths, for instance, nobody really had bothered to count for a long time how many workplace deaths and injuries you had across the country. Activists are very concerned about what happens after everyone goes home. I think these are questions we don't know the answer to.
Qatar's hope is that in the long run, memories of compelling matches will outlast any lingering controversy. The 2022 World Cup story echoes other mega events in recent years, where strong, centralized governments have spent lavishly to help build global prestige, only to find themselves marred by controversy.
If you look, for example, at the 2022 Winter Olympic bidding process, all of the democracies that were bidding in that process actually dropped out before the final bidding phase. The only two cities that were left were Beijing, China, and Almaty, Kazakhstan, both autocratic countries where there's no democracy, there's no input, there's no opportunity for residents to push back against the extravagance of the games.
Russia received a 4-year ban for doping from the World Anti-Doping Agency.
China has been criticized by some countries and human rights groups over what they say is abuse against Uyghur Muslims.
They're going to be under increasing pressures from corporate sponsors. They're creating all sorts of problems in terms of how the labor force is treated, in terms of environmental destruction, and so on. So corporations are sort of pulling back, or they're saying, well, if you expect us to stay around, you've got to clean this stuff up.
Mounting public concerns from citizens, cities, and sponsors over the recent spate of controversial games have forced organizing bodies like FIFA and the IOC to pursue reforms. One approach to address the sustainability concern has been to spread out mega events over a region or even a continent, instead of forcing a single city to take on the burden.
I think FIFA has an easier job only because there are more places that have the necessary venues and infrastructure, and because of the very profound and lasting and pervasive popularity of soccer. They have more leeway, I think, than the IOC. So hopefully we'll see some good changes there.
In fact, things are already looking differently in the next World Cup, which will be spread out in 16 cities across North America and rely mostly on existing infrastructure.
The World Cup is coming back to Boston in 2026, and it never crossed our minds to create a no Boston World Cup group because the costs are just going to be a small fraction of what hosting the Olympics would have been.
As for the Olympics, the IOC has spent the past decade reflecting on its complex legacy and outlining broad new reforms aimed at reinventing the Games for the sustainability-conscious 21st century.
Listen, the most important was a decade ago when we adopted the motto that a city does not adapt to the Games, but the Games adapt to a city. Then the second thing which was important is we don't build if it's not absolutely needed. We have a sustainability agenda that is very appealing as well. We'll be climate positive as a rule from 2030, but already Paris 2024 will be climate positive, which is a great objective to reach. I think everybody also is recognizing the efforts when it comes to sustainability and the whole agenda, economic, social, and environmental. Yes, it's more to deliver for the organizers, but for the better. The successful Olympics is one that, first and foremost, brings back to the community what they were expecting.
Even the bidding process, once a fierce competition that often encouraged the sort of wild promises that led to financial pitfalls, has been reshaped.
It is a partnership now. So we have cities that come to us and say, listen, what does it take if I want to organize the Games in 2040? And the big difference is that the IOC is not judging anymore the quality of a given value proposition. It is contributing to it.
The plans for upcoming games, Los Angeles in 2028, Milan in 2030, and Brisbane in 2032, already seem to be heeding the warning signs of the past. So far, at least. But some critics have proposed an even more radical concept.
What I would favor in the long run, what I think is most rational, particularly in these days of climate change and the need to conserve resources and not waste resources, is we ought to have one city that hosts the Games permanently.
Having everyone agree on a single host city might be a challenging diplomatic problem. Regardless, the institutional reforms within the World Cup and the Olympics demonstrate that mega sporting events can respond to the demands of an ever-evolving planet. And the days of massive cost overruns and wasteful infrastructure may be behind us.
I think there are much more sensible ways to proceed. Whether the world decides to be sensible or not, I think, is still an undecided question.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
It was unimaginable that we would see rates move this fast. That was not in the realm of thinking.
Just the timeline of what they knew and when they knew it. Why didn't they do anything about it?
When do we have to see the kill? It's always for the Fed to respond to it, and this is really the tension.
Be informed.
You cannot be overly data dependent. You've got to have a view of where you're going.
Be prepared.
I think the earnings season might actually be the positive surprise that people are not expecting.
Be ahead of the game.
Certainly the beginning of something we need to keep an eye on.
And that, I think, is really going to be an interesting takeaway from this moment.
You go all birds on us and you say, turn, turn, turn. Is that what we're doing right now?
Yeah, big question coming into this year for us was, when is that turn going to be?
What a fantastic conversation.
The news you need.
The president's calling on manufacturers to make more in America. It is working, and it's reflected in these jobs numbers.
The analysis you trust.
How do you take this anecdotal data and say, really, just focus on the now, because that is going to tell you where we're going?
What is the measurement of uncertainty that we have in studying the American economy?
Milton Friedman had said there are long and variable lags in the impact of monetary policy. But man, it's a long slog.
The best way to start your day.
People are tuning into this program on a daily basis.
Oh, come on, it makes for good TV.
Let's move on.
Bloomberg Surveillance, weekdays from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern. The moment news breaks, no one covers the world like Bloomberg.
On the AI question, what we don't really see is Apple doing a knee-jerk response and moving into the domain of generative AI.
Supporters of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan celebrating late into the night, dancing and singing.
We have a fundamental reassessment of everybody's capacity within OPEC. Should we talk about $95 and $100 oil again? Not for a while.
Bloomberg, your global business authority. This June, in honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month.
My guest this week is the Pulitzer Prize-winning American photographer Lindsay Addario. Ukraine, Afghanistan, South Sudan, to name but a few, she has been there with her camera at the majority of the conflicts in the 21st century. I want to hear about the stories behind those images and what it's like living, working, existing on the front lines of these wars. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me and joining all of our viewers. I know it's rare for you to be sitting in a seat safely away from what you're covering normally with your camera. You've come to the world's attention many times with your work over the years, but very recently, at the beginning of this year, in fact, just a few weeks after the war started in Ukraine, you did come to the attention of many people because you took a photo of a Ukrainian family of four trying to cross a bridge who had been killed, and that photo ended up on the front pages of the New York Times. Can you tell me a bit about how you came to that scene?
So I went directly to the East and was covering the East for about 10 days before the war started. When the war began, I went to Kiev and immediately was covering sort of daily missile strikes and the destruction and those who had been killed and injured. And so one day I was watching images come out from the wires and others who went to the Irpin Bridge. And there were, hundreds of civilians crossing, the elderly, women, children, crossing out of Irpin and all of those suburbs. And so we made our way toward the bridge through side roads. And as we approached, there were injured, the territorial defense soldiers were taking injured over to sort of a brick wall off to the side. So we ran across the street, and almost as soon as we got behind that wall, a round came in. So it was either a mortar round or a tank shell, we're not sure. It came in and hit sort of off to the distance. And then the Ukrainian military fired back. And so my security advisor said, would you like to go? And I said, no, because everyone knows this is a civilian evacuation route. And they're not, those rounds are probably going toward a Ukrainian base that's off in the distance. But how wrong I was. The next round came in closer. And so we dove for cover. And as soon as we popped back up, the next round came in right next to us, essentially. And it was sort of equidistant between us and a mother and her 2 children and a church volunteer that was helping usher them to safety. It was very chaotic. Obviously, we were all sort of in shock because the round had landed very close to us. Everything was very dusty. And our security advisor immediately went to the aid of the injured and to a soldier who was nearby. And by the time he called us over, the protocol is we wait to be told, it's clear, you can come. And so by the time he called us over, I ran across the street not knowing what to expect. Obviously, I knew there was someone injured, but I anticipated it being a soldier. And although there were civilians crossing steadily, and even during the strike, because nothing was shielded, so people had to continue to move. And so when I got there, I came upon these 4 lifeless bodies. Of course, I didn't know if they were dead or alive at that point. I noticed sort of the tiny little moon boots of a child. And as a mother, that was sort of a sort of incredibly jarring and devastating moment. And I was trying to survey, but I was also kind of in shock. And one side of my brain was sort of saying, you have to start photographing, and you have to take these pictures, because I knew that I had just witnessed something that was an intentional targeting of civilians. And so I took a few photographs, but rounds were still coming in. So our security advisor, Steve, was saying, hurry up, work very quickly, and we have to leave. And so I kind of moved around the scene and taking a few photographs, thinking in my head also, I have to be respectful, and, perhaps I shouldn't show the faces. So I was trying to take pictures that showed the faces and that didn't show the faces, so that we had some options.
But the image I'm talking about, or certainly the version I've seen, you don't necessarily look at the faces, actually, now you've said that, the way that you look at the image.
You can.
You can see them.
You can see them.
But it's more you look at the scene of a family.
Exactly. And so I've been doing this I've been covering war for over 20 years, and I know that there are so many images I've taken that have never been published because they're graphic. And so I was thinking of that as I was shooting, as horrible as that sounds, because obviously I've just witnessed the most devastating scene, but I'm also a photojournalist, and that's my job. And so I was trying different angles, and frankly, I didn't think the picture could ever be published because it was civilians.
Do you know the impact of that photo?
Yeah, it's been used by I think the United States ambassador to the United Nations to talk about the intentional targeting of civilians. It's been used repeatedly as proof that civilians were targeted, because I was there. I witnessed the run-up, and I know that whoever was firing those rounds was bracketing onto that position.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now. Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
What do you like most about your job?
I think the people.
ultimately, we're a people business. A lot of what my job is as CEO of the company is to give those people sort of motivation, to tell them where we're going, to encourage them to come up and do their best work, to encourage them to collaborate. Sometimes you sort of think you're almost a psychologist, as you are a business leader, I think, sometimes.
And so what's your best piece of advice?
I love pitches. I love being sort of leading from the front, if you like, and spending times with teams. I love to see the work that we're doing. When we pitch for a piece of new business, often when we come together. So I guess I try and put myself in the seat of the client. And what's the client going to think when they see this work? Are they going to be excited? Is it going to turn their brand around? How's it going to resonate with their consumers? So as much as possible, probably I try and play that role.
You mentioned being a mother. Has that changed the job for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely changed the job in the sense that I'm more cautious now than I was before I had children. I think to a sort of normal person who doesn't do this for a living, they probably can't see that. But for me, making decisions on a minute-to-minute basis in a war zone, I know I'm being more cautious. I know I'm not going sort of all the way to the front. Or as far forward as some of my colleagues might be going.
You also are now seeing, perhaps when you see an image, when you create an image, when you see the reality of a child who is dead in front of you, would have always affected you, I imagine.
Always.
Has it changed, though?
Yes, it has changed. I think, I have photographed children dying in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia during the Horn of Africa drought in 2011. And it was always devastating. But I think now as a mother, the first thing I do is sort of put myself in the shoes of that mother. And I know, I live in constant fear that something will happen to my children.
So you're trying to keep yourself safe, but you're also trying to document at the same time.
Of course.
And perhaps processing it in a slightly different way. I mean, would you say you have become desensitized, though?
No.
And do you have to be in any way?
No, not at all. I mean, I think I have ways of dealing with my emotion in that moment. But, part of that is just really focusing on the task at hand, which is making photographs and looking through the viewfinder. That definitely helps me focus on taking pictures. But I'm not desensitized at all. I mean, I cry pretty much all the time when I'm photographing. I get very, very emotional, and that's okay. I mean, I don't have an issue with that. I don't know what my colleagues think of me, but, I think it's normal. I mean, I'm a human being.
And do you think, you talked about hanging back because of the risk as well, not necessarily going straight to the front. And yet when I asked you about that particular image, it sounded like it's very instinctive when you know you're not where you need to be and you are heading towards danger.
Correct. And that's obviously what I struggle with, because if I'm close and something happens a little closer or a little further from me, but closer to the front line, I'll likely go. But I think where I'm positioning myself is sort of a little removed back and then making judgment calls every day. If I hear that a school has been hit and 30 children have been killed, I will go. If I hear that a building has been hit on the front line, but no civilians were killed, I'm likely not to go. So I'm weighing sort of what will I gain from risking my life.
Although that building's been hit, but no civilians have been killed, this talks to the idea of, not you per se, but a criticism of those in your field of being war junkies, trying to find the very worst to document and being in places they don't need to be, sometimes causing perhaps more risk. What do you say to that?
For me, the highest toll of war is civilian casualties. Yes. So that's not being a war junkie, that is documenting reality. And the reality is we are in a situation where one country has invaded another, and every civilian who dies is on account of that invasion. And so I think that if I'm in a position and civilians are being killed, I have to document that. That is a very important part of the job of someone who covers conflict.
And presumably that for you in this work that you do, you don't obviously just cover war, you've covered humanitarian disasters, climate change, the effects on the planet on that. But when it is about civilians, it sounds like the justification you have to make to yourself, to your family, and to those who could be critical is that you are providing evidence.
Yeah, and that evidence has been used already by the United Nations.
Have you taken pictures of people killing others, of the actual killers, before?
I mean, I've taken pictures of people who have been accused of killing others, but I have not been there sort of in the moment.
I just wonder what that's like as well, you know, the seeing people do the very worst they can do to each other.
I think people are very smart about journalists. You know, they obviously don't allow us access to things when they are killing civilians. You know, I think that there was a time in the Korengal Valley, I was with the American troops, the 173rd Airborne. I had spent 2 months living on the side of a mountain with the 173rd. Me and a colleague, Elizabeth Rubin, for the New York Times Magazine. And the point was to understand the nuances of war and why so many civilians were dying in Afghanistan. And in fact, Lieutenant Colonel Aslan, who was the commander of the Korengal Valley, was very smart because he had this philosophy of transparency, because he believed that journalists needed to understand sort of the nuances of war to understand why civilians were being killed. And so we were in Operation Rock Avalanche, which was in the movie, the documentary Restrepo, that I don't know if you've seen it, but it's extraordinary. And so we were in that operation where we jumped out of helicopters in the middle of the night into the heart of Taliban territory, literally walked with everything we owned for 6 days, and eventually we were ambushed by the Taliban. And we were ambushed from 3 sides, and there was a huge gun battle. 3 soldiers were shot, 1 was killed. And in the retaliation of the American troops, I was standing with some of the soldiers. Everyone was very shaken up, of course. And one of the soldiers said, "Look, they're using Afghan women and children as human shields." And he literally had me look through the scope of his gun. And there were women and children on the roofs of the building where they were shooting from. And that is a case where it was incredible to witness. And I could only have witnessed that because I had spent so much time with these troops and really was willing to risk my life and to be there in the middle of Operation Rock Avalanche.
A shot you took during that maneuver, we're going to take a look at that. Can you take me through it?
There is an image, the aftermath of that ambush, where it's a very dusty picture. It is a scout team carrying the body of Sergeant Rugal, and he's in a body bag, and it was after that. And the scout team, Clenard, who is sort of leading the way, is crying, and they're walking through this very sort of desolate landscape. And I remember shooting that photograph and asking myself, what are we doing here? You know, what are we doing here years after 9/11, fighting in the middle of the mountains where there are no people, you know? And it just felt like such a waste that this young man had died for nothing. And in fact, a few years later, the American troops pulled out entirely from that area.
There's another image of yours I wanted to bring to mind and for us to have a look at and talk about. An 18-year-old woman in labour stranded in 2009. Tell me about that and how that came about.
So in 2009, I won a MacArthur Fellowship. That is, in America, it's called a Genius Grant. And it's essentially given to all different disciplines, from a cellist to a scientist to a photographer, where I was paid a salary for 5 years with no strings attached to just focus on my work. And I felt a lot of pressure to decide what to focus on with my work, because it was the first time I could decide, not be assigned a story. And so I started doing research, and I decided to focus on maternal mortality and why over 500,000 women a year were dying in childbirth at that point. This was 2009, as you said. And Afghanistan, where I had been working for a decade at that point, had one of the highest rates of maternal death in the world. And that was because there was such a bad road network. Women who were pregnant or in labor didn't have access necessarily to medical professionals or to clinics or hospitals that were staffed with doctors.
They just couldn't get where they needed to get to.
They just couldn't get to where they needed to. They had to take a donkey for 12 hours, and imagine being in labor, getting on the back of a donkey. And so I went to very remote villages in Badakhshan province, which was one of these provinces with high numbers. And on the way back, I was riding with Dr. Ziba, who was also helping me translate. And we noticed these two women on the side of a mountain, and there was not a man with them, which in Afghanistan is very rare. And we stopped the car and said, what are you doing here? Do you need help? And it turned out the woman on the right, Noor Nisa, was in labor. And Noor Nisa's husband's first wife had died in childbirth, and he was so determined to not lose her that he managed to get a car in the village. But when we met them, their car had broken down, so they were stranded on the side of the road. So I said, well, just get in my car. I'll take you to the hospital. We're going toward Faizabad, which was the capital of the state. And they said, no, we need permission from the husband, so we'll wait. And so I turned to Dr. Ziba and I said, okay, you have to find the husband. There's one road in the whole province. He's obviously on that road, So she found him, of course, pretty quickly, and brought him back. And the whole family piled in my car, and we took them to the hospital. And everyone asked me if she delivered safely and if I took photographs. And yes, she delivered safely. But no, I did not take photographs because I felt like I changed the course of that story with my presence by taking them.
So but you took a photo.
I took about 3 frames, and that photograph is one of those frames.
And that's when you had met and just seen it, because it's so striking, the blue.
Exactly. I met them, we asked their story, and then we asked permission right before Ziba left to find the husband. We asked permission for me to take a few photographs.
So Fabien, talk to me a little bit about the ocean. It covers 70% of the planet. It gives us food. It gives us jobs. It gives us, of course, oxygen. We're taking too many fish out. We're polluting it. We're making it warmer. And only 3% of it is protected. What frustrates you the most about this?
The basic frustration is our ignorance. Our ignorance about how integral ocean is to not only our well-being, but to our existence. And for far too long, we've been using the ocean as an endless resource in a garbage can. Imagine our planet is a 3-dimensional system. The ocean represents 99% of our world's living space, about 3.4 billion cubic kilometers of volume, within which the vast majority of biodiversity lives and thrives. And that's what we're beholden to. That is what makes us possible as a species.
Do you think, on balance, being a woman has been a help to you in this field?
Huge help. Being a woman
rather than a hindrance.
Yes, everyone thinks it's a hindrance, but in fact, it's a huge help because people. First of all, I have access to men and women, and particularly when I'm working in countries like Afghanistan and Somalia, where men and women are usually segregated by gender. And people underestimate women, I find, and they still do. And so they sort of discount me and say, okay, sure, go do it.
It's nice to be underestimated.
Yeah, I love being underestimated. I love it. Yes.
It's one of those things. But I mean, I suppose on the other much more serious side of it is that, again, when you're thinking and calculating risks, rape as a weapon of war is a unique tool wielded against women.
Yes. And for me, when I've been kidnapped twice. The first time was in Iraq, and that was only a day, and it turned out, compared to Libya, was quite it was manageable in the sense that we were working outside of Fallujah. I was working with a colleague from the New York Times. We had heard a helicopter of American troops went down. We went to find it. we got caught by insurgents who thought maybe we were with the American occupation. We finally convinced them we were journalists. They held us until dusk and then eventually let us go. Obviously, it was terrifying. We had guns to our heads for about 11 hours. We didn't know if we would survive. Libya was much more violent, much more dramatic. We were 4 journalists in one car. Originally, we had been 2 in each car, but one of the driver's brothers had been shot at the front line, so he quit in the middle of the battle, and we ended up in one car. We had to decide how long to stay. That is not an easy discussion because with 4 journalists, everyone has a different perspective on how long to stay, what our needs are, how dangerous the situation is. By the time we decided to pull back east toward Benghazi, we ran into one of Gaddafi's troops' checkpoints. It was incredibly hostile. The rebels we had been covering started opening fire on that checkpoint, so we were literally in a wall of bullets. The men were pulled out of the car. Me as the only woman, I was sort of left sitting there because they didn't know what to do with me. But the car was not armored, so I had to get out of the car because I knew that I needed to get behind cover. I crawled across the back seat, and when I jumped out, one of Gaddafi's troops sort of came to me and was pulling at my cameras. Instinctively, I was pulling back, even though there were bullets literally going, zoom, zoom, next all around us. We finally made it to cover behind this sort of checkpoint building, and we're all told to lie face down in the dirt. We each had a Kalashnikov put to our heads, and we were about to be executed. We were begging for our lives. The commander came over at that point and said, "You can't execute them, they're American," which this was all in Arabic, and Anthony Shadid later translated for us. In retrospect, I have no idea why they spared us being American, because in the Middle East, a lot of people don't like our foreign policy. And so we were blindfolded, and essentially for the next 3 days, we were beaten up, tied up, blindfolded, threatened with execution. And for me, as the only woman, I was touched repeatedly. I was not raped, but of course, in that time, being tied up and blindfolded, I thought of the many, many women I have interviewed over the years who have been raped. And so I sort of ironically looked to them for strength, because I thought, well, if they survived it, and if it happens to me, I can survive it as well.
Are you living just minute to minute?
Minute to minute. Yeah, I mean, in a kidnapping, there is no sort of an hour down the line. It is literally every second is survival mode. It is, what can I do to get through this fear? What can I do to get through this pain?
I mean, it sounds like the scene from a film, and yet it's your life. And I believe Jennifer Lawrence has been interested in your life, although there was talk of a film.
She was. We spent about 3 years together when Warner Brothers optioned the rights to my memoir. I wrote a memoir after that called It's What I Do, A Photographer's Life of Love and War. And that memoir was optioned almost immediately by Warner Brothers. Steven Spielberg was slated to direct, and Jennifer Lawrence was slated to play me. And that went on for 3 years, if not longer.
What's it like taking Jennifer Lawrence to war zones?
I took her to the border with South Sudan when it was very, very tense. She wanted to understand what it feels like to feel that fear and to be close to a war zone. Obviously, we had to worry about her safety, so I couldn't take her.
Yeah, you got an extra headache. You got to worry about a Hollywood A-lister while you're dealing with everything else.
It was very stressful. Let's just say when I put her on the plane to, from Uganda, I couldn't walk for a week. My back went out. But she eventually dropped out. And so now it is being made into a limited series.
Okay. So a TV series.
A TV series,
film.
Correct.
Okay. But at least Jennifer Lawrence now knows what it's like to do your job.
She does. She's just come out with a movie playing a character named Lindsay. So, hey, I hope I helped.
She got that inspiration from. But what have you learned then from being in these scenarios, coming in and coming out of some of the worst things we can do to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've learned the capacity for survival, for resilience, for forgiveness. the fact that human beings can be equally evil as they can be amazingly generous and yeah, resilient. I think that I've learned a lot from the people I've covered, but I think we have to look at the ability of human beings to live both within those situations and to survive them after.
Well, thank you very much for taking us behind the lens with you.
Thank you,
Lindsay. And thank you so much for being with us. Until we meet again, take care and goodbye.
Studios in New York and San Francisco. Our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action. 12 p.m. on the East Coast, 9 a.m. in the West. Only on Bloomberg Television, your global business authority. Bloomberg UK, your source for news and analysis covering the biggest challenges facing the UK government, economy, financial services and markets.
Tax cuts should not be the priority. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
In this post-Brexit world, how do you see actually servicing your clients?
It was disruptive, and it's going to have implications to how capital raising works.
Now we're having the perfect storm in the UK.
Watch Francine Lacqua Thursdays at 9:30 a.m. only on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
We're investing in a lot of different capabilities and features that makes the in-store shopping experience that much easier, that much more compelling, whether it's price check, browsing inventory in this store, so that we can really make that experience as convenient and as simple as possible.
Convenient, simple, that's sort of what people have needed in the age of COVID. Is that here to stay, or do we go back when finally we all hope that the pandemic will be behind us in some way? Do our changing shopping habits go back again?
What's really interesting about retail in my 20-plus experience is that convenience never reverts itself. Now, the form of convenience has shifted, whereas, say, in 2000 to 2010, a lot of convenience was driven by more stores nearby. Now it's stores in addition to digital. Yeah. There's nothing closer than the phone in your hand.
My guest this week is the Oscar-winning American actor, producer, and world-class archer, Geena Davis. After shooting to fame in films such as Beetlejuice, she spent a large part of her career now championing gender diversity across the media. I want to ask her today, though, about what words of advice Dustin Hoffman gave her when dealing with tricky male co-stars, and how Susan Sarandon changed her life when they filmed their iconic Thelma and Louise movie. Welcome, Geena Davis. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the memoir.
Thank you.
As well. And I think there's a theme in there that people may be surprised by, which is faking it until you make it. The idea that you, as an actor, got your confidence as you were going through your career, not the other way around.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Right, yeah. I was a sort of a badass on screen way before I ever, felt like that in real life. But the roles I played actually had an impact on me personally, and I think exactly as you said, fake it till you make it, that I was practicing being somebody confident and comfortable in the world, and it was like an opportunity to try it on, and then incorporate it in my real life.
How long do you think it took? How old were you when maybe you felt like a badass in real life?
Well, maybe around Thelma and Louise was the first time that I felt like, yeah, I could be kind of like this person.
Yeah, I mean, if you go on a crime spree with a woman on a road trip.
Exactly. I haven't really gone on any crime sprees yet. But, you know, it's there. The potential is there.
We will definitely come back to Thelma and Louise, but that was in your mid-30s, so maybe
Yes,
around that point.
yeah.
The book is called Dying of Politeness, and as part, a dedication to your parents, who I was fascinated even changed the spelling of your name to avoid awkwardness.
Right. Well, it wasn't that they changed it. My real name, or given name, was Virginia, and since my aunt was